Section 32 of Zoology, the Science of Animal Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Zoology, the Science of Animal Life by Ernest Ingersoll. Some notable water birds. From these relics of geologic antiquity, the remainder of the birds now living, and their fossil ancestors as well, differ fundamentally and are united in a division whose badge is the keel on the sternum. Hence they are termed carinate birds, Carinatae. The list begins with the most archaic order, that is of the loons, of which 3 or 4 species are named, but they are hardly separable. They are as big as geese, have black backs checkered with white spots, white undersurfaces, and heads purplish-black, variously marked, and these heads and necks have a very reptilian look, as they stretch forward their heads inquiringly, or utter the wild laughter that seems so consonant with the lonely waters they frequent. The reptilian suggestion is even stronger in their cousins, the grebes, known to gunners as die-dappers, hell-divers, etc., on account of the quickness with which they will disappear when alarmed. The family badge is on the feet, where the toes are not connected by a full web, as in loons, but every toe is margined by a flange of firm skin with a scalloped margin. Grebes have a way of swimming with the whole body under water, when the exposed head and neck look very snaky. The brown and white plumage of grebes is exceedingly close and dense, and their indifference to wet and cold is shown by the fact that their nests are mere rafts of sodden weeds, often so loosely tied to the rushes that they go adrift. Grebes abound on all northern waters, and are rarely shot since the taking of their silvery breasts for hat ornaments has been stopped. The penguins constitute an order limited in range to the Antarctic region. The picture is in everybody's mind. A bird that stands as erect as a soldier on 2 almost invisible legs and a short stiff tail, and carries a small head, sometimes plumed, with a strong pointed bill. The picture usually represents the great flocks that resort in the brief summer to their rocky breeding places on icy shores, each female guarding and incubating her 2 eggs in the rudest of nests on the ground. These Antarctic rookeries sometimes hold tens of thousands. During the rest of the year, the penguins are at sea, or under it, behaving more like seals than birds, for their scale-like plumage is impervious to water, and the stubby wings are in effect flippers by which they swim under water, the strong webbed feet only acting as rudders until they come to the surface and can paddle. Penguins feed on crustaceans and mollusks, mostly, but also on fish and seaweed. Next comes that group of wide sea wanderers, the albatrosses and petrels, united in the family Procellareidae, whose special mark is found in the 2 bony tubes along the top of the beak that contain the nostrils. Of the albatrosses many species are known, nearly all inhabitants of the southern oceans, although 2 or 3 of the largest regularly visit the North Pacific coast, and more rarely one strays into the North Atlantic. Certain small species frequent the western coast of South America. The one best known is the wandering albatross, whose wings spread 9 or 10 feet, yet are only 9 inches wide. They spend their whole lives on the open ocean, and undoubtedly sleep there, regardless of storm or calm, but in summer land on some lone Antarctic island or lofty shore, and construct a heap of mud and rubbish on top of which they deposit 2 chalky eggs. Their relatives, the oceanic petrels, are much smaller as a rule, and some no bigger than sparrows. They are of many kinds, including fulmars, shearwaters, etc., and nearly all are black or sooty brown, usually with touches of white. Most of the group are denizens of the southern hemisphere, but some belong in the north and are migratory, and the eastern Atlantic and Mediterranean are the home of the original stormy petrels, which sailors call Mother Carey's chickens, and regard with mingled superstition and affection. Leach's white-rumped petrel of our New England coast shares this name. Some of the far southern species are almost as big as albatrosses. Petrels get their food from both the waves and the shore, and follow ships on long voyages in hopes of scraps of flesh thrown overboard. Most of them breed in holes dug in the topsoil of sea-fronting cliffs, and lay white eggs. Many hide in these holes by day, and go out only at night, filling the air with wild cries while they hunt, but fulmars and shearwaters, which make rude nests on rough shores or on cliff ledges, often in vast colonies, go abroad in daylight, and throng the Grand Banks and wherever else fishing is going on. Next, In the classification based on structure rather than on superficial resemblances comes a large assemblage of water birds, some exclusively marine, others of inland waters. Here are placed those long-winged, graceful oceanic flyers, the tropic birds, and the many kinds of gannets, snowy white, that soar and plunge like falcons as they sweep over the waves and pick up incautious squids, fishes, etc. Most of them are tropical, but one gannet is well known on both shores of the North Atlantic, where it nests in thousands on the cliff faces that bound such lofty islets as the Bass Rock near Edinburgh, the Hebrides, and Bird Rock in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The flight is easy and powerful, and the food is caught by a hawk-like plunge. The nearest relatives of these white birds are the cormorants, which are shining black, glossy, with blue or green reflections. They are scattered over the whole globe, most of them along seashores, but many breed on inland lakes and swamps, usually in large companies. Unlike the sweeping and beautiful flight of the far-wandering gannets, these birds appear heavy on the wing, and instead of snatching their food from the surface, they dive after the fishes on which they feed, and pursue their slippery prey under water, swimming with both wings and feet, and dodging here and there in a most surprising way. Their bills are peculiarly well adapted to holding what they catch, and a near relative of the West Indies and southward often spears its prey with its bill. This is the darter, or snake bird, so called because its long neck and small head gives it a peculiarly snake-like appearance as it swims with nothing above the surface but the slender head, and that making scarcely a ripple. Far more of a wanderer is the tropical long-tailed, long-winged, black frigate bird, which is the hawk of the sea, for it hovers about the flocks of fishing birds and forces them to disgorge their catch, which it appropriates as it falls. Among the birds that suffer most from its robberies are the pelicans, several species of which live close to salt water in various parts of the world, while others prefer the lakes and swamps inland. We have two common species in the United States, the white pelican, seen all over the interior of the country in summer, and the brown, which is southern and maritime. Both are gregarious, not only in their annual migrations but in their breeding, building nests on bushes in large companies. Their food is mainly fish, caught both by diving and by scooping them up as they swim. The well-known peculiarity of the pelican is the bag of naked skin that hangs from the underside of the bill and serves as a receptacle for the catch. When it is filled, the bird returns to its resting place to consume its food at leisure, or to open wide its mouth and allow its nestlings to pick out the contents of the bag. All the foregoing are mainly marine, and have short legs and webbed feet, used principally in swimming. But we now come to the freshwater waders, the herons, bitterns, storks, ibises, and the like, whose bodies are perched on stilt-like legs, and whose habits require them to wade about in marshes and swamps in search of their miscellaneous food. Hence the neck also is long, and the bill straight and sharp-edged to fit it for seizing and holding the active prey by a sudden thrust. All warm and temperate countries possess herons in a great variety of species, varying in size from a bird 3 1/2 feet long, such as our great blue heron, to one a few inches only in length, but the colours are usually light and prevailingly bluish or greenish, while the marsh-loving bitterns are streaked brown. Some are pure white, as is our elegant egret, which has been all but exterminated in the United States by men who kill it in the breeding season, when the beautiful plumes that then adorn its back are at their best, and are marketable as ornaments for hats and military shakos. Every plume bird so killed means the loss of a family of young. Herons are shy, solitary birds as a rule, nesting in trees and remote swamps in rookeries, to which they return year after year from their winter retreat in the tropics, and they get their food, which includes every sort of living thing they can find, mostly by standing motionless in the water until it comes near enough to be picked up by a swift stroke. The storks are similar birds, with their rather heavier bodies and a way of standing erect, and of holding the head straight out in flight. The herons draw it back by curving the neck, which distinguishes them. They are white and black as a rule, and mainly oriental or African, no typical species occurring in the United States. Storks are more inclined to search the land for food than are the herons, and an Egyptian species is locally called a bird of blessing, because it cleans the villages, while the stately adjutant of India is carefully protected as a similar scavenger. The most familiar of the storks, however, is the white one that in Europe nests on the roofs of houses, chimney tops, and similar places, and is generally regarded with an affection that has been expressed in many a poem and story. Ibises are much like storks, the common sacred ibis of Egypt probably owing its religious distinction to its fondness for lizards and snakes, a service highly appreciated in that country. Several ibises inhabit America, one of which is not uncommon along the border of the Gulf of Mexico, while another is noted for the splendid scarlet of its plumage. In the same family is the beautiful spoonbill of our Gulf coast, whose name refers to the spatulate expansion of the end of the beak. Its richly roseate hue is reproduced in the dress of the flamingos that need not be described. We pass from the flamingos to the ducks by an intermediate form, the curious chahas and horn screamers of northern South America, large turkey-like birds, often tamed and made of service on country places, where they guard the poultry against hawks and other enemies. The ducks are a cosmopolitan family, Anatidae, of about 200 species, divisible into 5 groups, namely mergansers, river ducks, marine ducks, geese, and swans. These have many features in common, one of which is that in the early autumnal moult all the wing quills drop out at once, so that for a time none of them is able to fly. The mergansers, sheldrakes, or sawbills, are fish-eaters, catching their prey under water, but they move expertly by means of the narrow, tooth-studded bill that reminds us of the Ichthyornis. They frequent rivers, and most of them prefer rushing streams. Of our 3 species, 2 breed only in the far north, the third on the Pacific slope. During the winter they resort to a marine life in warmer latitudes. The river ducks, Anatinae, are distinguished from the seafaring ducks, Philogallinae, not only by their preference for inland lakes and marshes, but by the fact the hind toe bears no lobe, while in the sea ducks it is somewhat webbed and functional. This group includes some well-known species as the mallard, black duck, gadwall, widgeon, baldpate, teals, shoveler, pintail, and the exquisite wood duck, to speak of American species alone. The mallard and wood duck breed all over the continent, the latter having the peculiarity of making its nest in trees, but the others rarely nest south of Canada, except among the mountains of the Pacific slope. The seafaring ducks in North America also include several species that are found on inland bays and salt marshes, such as Chesapeake Bay and its borders, and do not limit their migratory routes to the seacoast, but fly over land. Such are the redhead and canvasback, the scorps and golden eyes and the ringneck, but the eiders, the scoters, and some others are truly oceanic. Most of these breed in the far north, always nesting on the ground, as is the rule of the whole family, except the golden eyes, which choose hollows in stumps and trees. None of the ducks lays spotted eggs. While among the ducks the male is likely to wear, at least in the breeding season, more gaily coloured plumage than the female, often of extraordinary beauty, among the geese both sexes are alike, and either white throughout, as in most of our species, or brown or grey, with more or less black, as in the brants, and in our common, wild, or Canada goose. Geese are far more terrestrial than ducks, and visit the land to nip the herbage, young corn, or cereals, in California doing serious damage to growing crops. All our species breed in Arctic lands except the Canada goose, which still makes its nest in the northern parts of the United States and throughout Canada. Most of them spend the winter south of our country. They represent to most persons the idea of bird migration. "We see the living wedge of long-necked birds," says Chapman, "passing high overhead. The unbroken sound waves bring the sonorous honks with unexpected distinctness to our ears, and we receive an impressive lesson in the migration of birds. They are embarked on a journey of several thousand miles, but they come and go as surely as though they carried chart and compass. All these geese are larger than the ducks, so the swans surpass the geese in size and are indeed the largest of water birds. The 8 species are distributed all over the world, everywhere frequenting fresh waters alone, and all are white except a black-headed Argentine species and the holy black swan of Australia. Before the discovery of this Australian curiosity a black swan was the proverbial rara avis, something incredible. Swans live mainly on weeds and roots pulled up from the bottom, but also eat snails and so forth. 2 species, the whistling and the trumpeter swans, belong to the American fauna, but both are now rare. End of section 32, read by Inkell.
Section 33 of Zoology, the Science of Animal Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in June 2024. Zoology, The Science of Animal Life by Ernest Ingersoll. Chapter 24, Vultures, Falcons, and Game Birds. The so-called birds of prey include three quite distinct groups: the American vultures, the hawk and eagle tribe, and the fishhawks. All agree in having strong, hook-pointed beaks, in many cases with a tooth-like point on the cutting edge of the upper mandible, and covered at the base by a fleshy cere, and in having claws of great strength termed talons. This cat-like armament, adapted to seizing and holding living prey and tearing its flesh, indicates the predaceous nature and practice of the tribe, but it is developed to its fullest extent only in the falcons and powerful eagles, since a large part of the order are carrion feeders or catch nothing larger than grasshoppers. Among the carrion feeders are the condors of the Andes and his almost extinct cousin, the California condor, which are the largest flying birds in the world. Near relative to them are the turkey buzzard and the carrion crow of our southern states, besides some tropical species. The vultures of the Old World are, as a rule, big birds inhabiting mountainous and desert places and capable of overcoming almost any disabled or weak animal. A small one that in North Africa plays the role of town scavenger, as does our turkey buzzard, is famous under the Egyptian name of Pharaoh's chicken. The partial nakedness of the head, often accompanied by a great neck ruff, is a characteristic of all these birds. The Lemurgier of the Alps and eastward to India connects in its structure and habits the vultures, Vulturidae, with the real predatory family Falconidae, in which are placed the hundreds of species of buzzards, harriers, hawks, eagles, and sea eagles that subsist by killing and eating every kind of creature that is within the power of each one to overcome. The bulk of their prey consists of small rodents, and in pursuing them they rid the land of vast numbers of little gnawers, most injurious to agriculture. It should be the business of every farmer and orchardist to learn to recognize the 3 or 4 fierce little poultry-catching falcons in his locality and refrain from killing any other sort of hawk. It is a hopeless task to give any detailed description of game birds, which are worldwide in their distribution and practically of the greatest importance to mankind, for in this group are found the originals of our domestic poultry, the jungle fowls of India, and the quails, partridges, grouse, pheasants, turkeys, curassows, and many more of hardly more interest to the naturalist than to the sportsman. The sportsman is willing to count the toothsome rails as game when he goes after them in the marshes of the middle coastal states. They are plain-colored birds that run around amid the salt grass and reeds, and are an interesting example of adaptation to this special station in life, for their bodies are notably compressed, so that a rail can slip through a narrower space than any other bird of its size, hence the proverb, "thin as a rail." A common species in Europe is known in literature as corncrake, and American relatives, the gallinues of freshwater marshes, go by the name of mud hens. The rails belong to the crane family, which includes many large tropical birds besides our own 2 kinds of cranes, both becoming rare in the United States. Good sport and delicate fare are afforded also by the great tribe of shore birds, plovers, yellowlegs, curlews, snipe, and the various sandpipers that feed along the seashore or frequent the inland marshes of every part of the world, nowhere more numerously than along our much embayed eastern coast. The plovers are especially interesting, and one of them, the noisy killdeer, is familiar all over the country, breeding in upland fields where 4 brown and spotted eggs are laid in a little hollow of the open ground, plover fashion. Another notable species, the golden plover, is a cosmopolitan and a remarkable migrant, journeying from its Arctic breeding place to the tropics, not only overland but across thousands of miles of ocean, as from Nova Scotia direct to Bermuda, and Alaska to Hawaii. The crested lapwing of Europe is another famous species. The plovers have short bills and live on insects, but the sandpipers that in greenish or brown-streaked coats flit along the shore pick up a more miscellaneous fare from the edge of the sea and on exposed tide flats. Here, too, are the very long-legged stilts, the phalaropes with lobes along their toes like a grebe, the curlews with their long up-curved bills, the willets that alarm all the rest by their cries as soon as they espy a gunner, the big gray godwits, and many others. Various snipes form a group of small, swift flyers that haunt boggy land, where they probe the mud with long bills furnished with nerves of great delicacy at the tip, by which they can feel the hidden worms buried in the mud that are their favorite fare. And one of them is the swamp-haunting woodcock, beloved of gourmands on both sides of the ocean. Europe and Asia have several other kinds of birds in this class, not known here, such as the coursers and the Egyptian zigzag, that now and then picks the crocodile's teeth and is almost the same as the historic lapwing, so familiar in Scotland. End of section 33.
Section 34 of Zoology, the Science of Animal Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Zoology, the Science of Animal Life by Ernest Ingersoll. From Gulls to Kingfishers. Our scientific arrangement introduces next the gull family, followed by a series of groups that seems to the layman most miscellaneous. The gulls are a worldwide family of seabirds, seen also near bodies of water in the interior of continents, especially northward, which live on fish and floating edibles. They are mostly glistening white, often marked with black about the head and wings, except the big brownish skuas that live by robbing other gulls of their catch and their nests of young. A very distinct group in the family are the smaller terns, whose slender forms, long wings, and graceful flight give them the suitable name of sea swallows. Another distinct lot is that of the low-flying black skimmers. All these birds normally breed on sandbanks near shore, laying 4 handsomely variegated eggs in a mere shallow of earth, but a good many nest in colonies on the margin of freshwater lakes. The gulls serve well as scavengers, but are not good to eat. Related to the gulls, but very different in appearance, are the small dark-colored quaint auks, guillemots, and puffins of northern coasts. They look like miniature penguins, for they stand erect on 2 big feet. They are fishers with great skill in swimming and diving, and breed in companies of thousands, sometimes on the ledges of the sea-fronting cliffs of Labrador, northern Scotland, Alaska, and Arctic islands. The extinct great auk of the North Atlantic coast was the giant of this race. Passing the sand grouse of Africa and Russia, we come to the pigeons, represented in a bewildering variety of forms in every part of the world. The United States has several species: the common wood dove or mourning dove, the extinct wild pigeon, once here in millions, the banded pigeon of the Pacific coast, and several kinds of ground doves in the Southwest. The rock dove, which is the original of the domestic varieties, is still wild in Europe, together with several other species, and the Orient abounds in representatives of the family, some of them large and extremely handsome, especially in the division called fruit pigeons. To this family belonged that famous bird of the past, the dodo of Mauritius. There follow 2 big groups, the cuckoos and plantain eaters, and the parrots, which together have the peculiarity of 2 toes in front and 2 behind, instead of the customary 3 toes in front and 1 or perhaps none behind. The woodpeckers have the same yoke-toed arrangement, but are distinct otherwise. The cuckoos are mainly oriental and very varied, although all show the slender form, long tail, and long curved beak that we see in our two American species, the black-billed and yellow-billed. The most aberrant one in our country is the queer lizard-catching roadrunner of Southern California. None of the cuckoos seem a good nest maker. The nests of our common ones are loose platforms of twigs, and both species often drop eggs in each other's cradles, but they, in common with almost all the other cuckoos of the world, do at least incubate their eggs and care for the nestlings, instead of leaving the task to some foster parent, as does the similar cuckoo of Europe. The most extraordinary feature of this parasitic habit is the fact that the cuckoo often, if not always, first lays its egg in any convenient place, and then, taking it in its beak, carries it to another bird's nest and puts the egg into it. This accounts for the frequent finding of a cuckoo's egg in nests into which so large a bird could not have crept. To record the fact that about 500 different kinds of parrots are catalogued will be a sufficient explanation of their dismissal with a few general remarks. The larger number and most striking examples, the great cockatoos, for instance, belong to Australia and the Malayan Islands, but the Indian region, Africa, and tropical America abound in parrots. Probably the northernmost of the whole family is our Carolina parakeet, which formerly ranged in summer even to the Great Lakes, but now is almost exterminated even from the great swamps of the Gulf Coast. Of the two kinds most often seen in cages, a custom that is almost prehistoric in antiquity, the gray parrot is African, and the green or green and yellow Amazons come from South America. Parrots are gregarious, nest in holes in trees, although a few live in holes in the ground or among loose rocks, and feed on all sorts of vegetable productions, including some very hard fruits cracked in their powerful bills, as is the habit of the gorgeous macaws of Central and South America. The lories of Australia are provided with tongues brush-like at the tip, and besides eating seeds, they lick the honey out of the blossoms of the eucalyptus and other flowering trees, and in doing so effect the cross-fertilization of these trees in a country which has no bees to do that service. Passing the brilliant rollers of the Old World and the motmots and little gem-like toadies of the New, we come to the extensive tribe of kingfishers, of which our blue and white example is a very modest specimen, but the only one we have, while 150 other species are counted in the rest of the world, most of them in the Austro-Malayan region and in Africa. They vary immensely in size, colors, food, and habits. A large section are not fishers at all, but dwell in wooded places and subsist on insects caught on the wing, and on reptiles, mice, etc., like birds of prey. Few groups are so diversified and entertaining as this one. Related to them are the bee-eaters, hoopoes, hornbills, and others that bring us to the owls, a suborder which contains the great nightjar family, to which our whippoorwills and nighthawks belong, with the swifts and hummingbirds as near relations. Then come the woodpeckers, much alike all over the world, but absent from Australia, followed by the gorgeous trogons of Mexico and some other tropical beauties. End of section 34.
Section 35 of Zoology, the Science of Animal Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Michele Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in June 2024. Zoology, the Science of Animal Life by Ernest Ingersoll. Chapter 26, Passerine Birds. We have now run through the list of all the orders of birds, except the last and largest, the passerine birds, the ordinary songsters of the field and woodlands of the northern hemisphere. There are 50 families contained in the order. Here, among our North American migratory birds, are to be found the kingbirds, peewees and other tyrant flycatchers, the larks of our western plains and eastern seashore, that sprite of the Rocky Mountain brooks, the ouzel, the waxwings, the butcher birds, the pretty greenish vireos that build those exquisite cup-shaped hanging nests made of grapevine bark and spider's silk, and the swallows that become so friendly every summer about barns, paying rent by diligent service and killing insects. Then there is that interesting little group of small and cheerful climbers, the nuthatches, chickadees, and creepers, that rid trees of hosts of injurious insects, which they dig out of crevices of the bark as they scramble up and down the trunks, some of them continuing the good work all through the winter. These have their counterparts in Europe, for in respect of our common songbirds, as of the birds of prey and game birds, the avifauna of Europe and North America is virtually one. The differences are mainly in the few representatives of tropical groups that visit northern countries in summer, those of Europe partaking of the African or Indian families, while we have wandering species from groups that are properly inhabitants of Mexico and southward. Such, in fact, are our few hummingbirds, hundreds of species of which belong to the American tropics and none to the Old World, our two tanagers, members of a very large tropical family, and our blackbirds and orioles, far more numerous in species south of the United States. While we have many delightful vocalists, the best singers of all our birds are no doubt the thrushes, and that is true of thrushes everywhere. For the European blackbird and mavis, the celebrated nightingale, the solitaire, both that of the West Indies and that of our northern Pacific coast, and several noted musicians in the Orient, are of this melodious family. Which is the best singer of them all will never be settled, for the citizen of each country likes best that to which he is most used. But to Americans nothing can be better than the evening carol of the wood thrush, the serene hymn-like music of the hermit, or the sweet and wavering call of the veery. Yet in the South, where these northern thrushes are rarely heard at their best, the palm is given to the mockingbird, which, like the northern brown thrasher, rivals all in turn by simulating their notes in a liquid melody that, especially when heard in the calm of a moonlit summer evening, seems of surpassing beauty. End of section 35.
Section 36 of Zoology, The Science of Animal Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Zoology, The Science of Animal Life by Ernest Ingersoll. Chapter 27. The Beasts of the Field, Some Primitive Types. We have now arrived at the highest rank in the scale of animal life, the four-footed, hair-clad, milk-nursed denizens of our woods and fields, the subclass Mammalia, mammals. These are the animals of popular speech, but accuracy requires a more distinctive expression, for every living thing not a plant is an animal. Unfortunately, no such distinctive term exists in our language, and hence we must borrow from the Latin the word mammal for this group. It is correct, easy to remember, and there is no reason why it should not be used popularly as well as scientifically. It is good because it is exact and expresses the one great distinction which separates mammals from all other animals, the feeding of the young on milk secreted by the mother. The milk-producing glands were called in Latin mammae, whence our word mammal, and the technical term mammalia, animals that suckle their young. Another peculiarity of the group is the coat of hair, persistently growing threads of horny substance produced from the skin in greater or less abundance and of varying quality and color. Its chief purpose appears to be that of keeping the body warm, and, as in the case of the feathers clothing birds, it enables the blood to rise to and maintain a temperature much higher than that of the air, hence the mammals are warm-blooded. This condition, gradually acquired, stimulated their activity and hence their brain development, the result of which is a higher degree of intelligence than is manifested, as a class, by any other animals, and a moving cause of their progress to the highest plane of organic evolution. The history of the evolution of the Mammalia may be traced back to obscure beginnings in the Triassic, the oldest of the three divisions of the secondary or Mesozoic era. Just preceding that time, there flourished a group of reptiles, the Theromorpha, whose skull, teeth, and forelimbs were very like those of a modern beast of prey, and zoologists consider it altogether probable that the origin of the mammalian branch must be looked for among their number. It is not doubted, however, that true mammals, although very small and inconspicuous, existed throughout the whole Mesozoic era, despite the fact that the world at that time was filled with ravenous reptiles. Indeed, it is believed that their steady development was an important agency in destroying the reptile population, largely by eating their eggs. At any rate, before the end of the Mesozoic era, the two grand divisions of Mammalia, Prototheria and Eutheria, had become established, and also the two primary divisions for the latter, the marsupials and the placentals, had been separated. Then came that extraordinary change in the physiography of the globe that marked the end of the Mesozoic conditions and introduced those of the succeeding era named Tertiary. In the broader and higher land areas and the drier and more invigorating climate that followed, producing a vegetation tending constantly to become like that of the present, mammals found increasingly favorable conditions and became the dominant race of animals. Relics of primitive types. There live in Australia and New Guinea two curious little animals that most nearly represent in their low and generalized organization the primitive mammals, and differ so essentially from all other mammals that they are classed by themselves as Prototheria, first beasts. They are the duckbill, Ornithorhynchus, and the spiny anteater, Echidna. The duckbill is a small, softly furred, web-footed creature, as aquatic in its habits as a beaver, which finds its food in the worms and other things that live in and on the mud of its chosen stream, and digs a burrow in the bank for its home, where it stays most of the daylight hours, and where its young are born. Its special peculiarity is that instead of the muzzle and mouth of an ordinary mammal, it is furnished with a bill like that of a duck, and each jaw is armed with horny plates to do the work of teeth. In the young ones, true molar, milk teeth are present, but are soon shed. The cheeks contain pouches in which a quantity of food can be stored, the animal carrying it into the safety of its burrow to be eaten, and so avoiding the danger of being out for a long time of feeding. The echidnas are equally small, about 18 inches long, covered with a mingled coat of hair and strong spines, and mounted on short legs and feet armed with powerful claws, for this animal dwells on land, and not only burrows, but must tear to pieces the hills of the ants that form its only food. Its round little head terminates in a long, slender snout containing a ribbon-shaped tongue, with which it licks up the ant from their ruined nests. The striking peculiarity of both these queer creatures, however, is the fact that they lay eggs. These are few, sometimes only one, and recall those of reptiles in their relatively large size, parchment-like shells, and abundance of food yolk. The duckbill deposits her egg in her grass-lined burrow nest, and covers them with her body until they quickly hatch. The blind and naked young then apply their lips to the nearest part of the mother's abdomen and suck milk through the pores of the skin. In the echidna, one sees a little advance on this extremely simple beginning of nursing, for here, instead of being laid in a burrow nest and covered by the mother, the echidna's egg is placed by the mother within two parallel folds of skin, which at that season form a deep groove in the abdomen enclosing the nursing area, and is held there until it hatches. When the young has attained a certain size, the mother removes it from the pouch, but takes it in from time to time to suckle it. Such are the Prototheria, one of the grand divisions of Mammalia, set apart by reason of their laying the eggs, from which the young will afterward be born, whereas in the other division of Eutheria, proper mammals, the embryos or unborn young escape from the eggs in a less or greater degree of development before their birth from the mother. This period between the conception of life in the egg and its emergence at birth is called the period of gestation and is much longer in large animals than in small ones. Fundamental differences in method of birth divide the Eutheria into two groups, designated as non-placentals and placentals. The marsupials. The word marsupial means pouched and refers to the most characteristic peculiarity of the non-placental division, order Marsupialia, which is the possession of a more or less pocket-like fold in the skin of the abdomen of the females within which the extremely immature young are nourished. The egg-laying mammals, also non-placental, have the young enclosed in a protective shell that they keep warm, as do the birds, until the embryo is sufficiently matured to be safely born. In the marsupials, nature meets the difficulty another way. The embryo is but a little advanced when born. In fact, it is utterly helpless and minute, being, even in the case of the largest kangaroos, hardly as big as a mouse. It would be fatal, of course, to turn it loose upon the world, and therefore the mother is provided with the pouch already described. The instant an embryo is born, the mother picks it up and places it within the pouch, where it crawls about until it touches and instinctively takes hold of one of the thread-like teats. As it gets stronger, it leaves the pouch now and then, but returns to it for nursing, sleeping, and protection when alarmed, until finally it departs altogether. This description applies to the most advanced family of the order. In the oldest and most generalized family of marsupials, such as the banded anteaters, there is virtually no pouch at all. As almost the whole marsupial tribe are natives of Australasia, it is odd that the family with which we must begin a list of them, the true opossums, should be American and quite unknown in Australia. This is explainable when it is known that this family, Didophidae, is the most archaic of this ancient tribe and was well established in Cretaceous times, and then and later was widely distributed in Europe and on this continent, yet so little change has occurred in the race that teeth from the Laramie formations of Wyoming are hardly distinguishable from those in the jaws of our possum up a gum tree today. No wonder the quaint creature is hoary and wrinkled. He is a very Methuselah among mammals and looks it. All opossums seem to have disappeared from Europe before the close of the Miocene, but continued to survive numerously in South America. They probably owe their long career, in competition with animals of so much higher grade, to their small size, forest life, nocturnal habits, ability to eat all sorts of food, and most of all, to their great fecundity. Our common opossum is the most northern of its kind and ranges over the whole country as far north as the latitude of Lake Erie. It appears never to have crossed the Hudson River until comparatively recent times, but is now frequently met with in New England and on Long Island. It is at home in all sorts of places, except perhaps on the dry plains, for it is primarily an arboreal animal, aided in climbing about trees by its naked, prehensile tail, by which it may hang to a branch while using its forefeet to rob a bird's nest or gather fruit. It will eat anything it can get hold of, and with its sharp teeth, which number 50, will kill animals as large as itself. Hence it is a destructive raider of hen roosts and sitting birds, as well as seeker of mouse nests and insects. Opossums are amazingly prolific and have broods of a dozen or more in many cases. These often crawl on the mother's back and cling with claws and twisted tails to her fur and tail, and so are carried about. Burdened by these kittens, she hunts daily, or rather at night for the most part, and defends them savagely and bravely against foxes and other enemies, often successfully standing off the farmer's dogs. With a family to defend, or when faced by any force that is at all equal to his powers, the opossum does not resort to playing possum, for this is the last resource when surprised and cornered by an overwhelming danger that it can neither avoid nor cope with. The proverbial feigning of death by this animal, many other small animals do the same, has excited much popular interest and has received many explanations. I have suggested that it is a survival of a practice which in past ages had been an advantageous ruse of the ancestors of the opossums. Several other species of opossums exist in Central and South America, some much smaller than ours and one hardly bigger than a mouse. One kind, the yapok, is aquatic, dwelling on land only during the infancy of its progeny and until they are old enough to be taught to swim. All the other marsupials inhabiting the Americas, except a rare little mole-like one in Patagonia, belong in the family of Didelphidae, but this family is not known in Australia, where the so-called opossums belong to a different tribe. They were named after our common northern opossum, which was known to science before Australia and its pouched fauna were discovered. One of the extraordinary things in zoology is that Australia and the nearby islands that constitute with it a faunistic province has no indigenous mammals, except a few mice and bats, other than marsupials, which have become so diversified as to represent the varied kinds of animals seen elsewhere. And no marsupials live anywhere else in the world except our single and primitive American family. This curious situation has caused much discussion. It is known that in late Mesozoic times, marsupials were scattered all over the globe, but became exterminated everywhere outside of Australasia and America long before the present era. The Australian marsupials are supposed to be the survivors, flourishing in a favorable region. But why no other mammals survived, there is still a puzzle. Another theory is that Australia, regarded as formerly a part of a much larger southern continent, is the original center, from which the ancestors of the marsupialia spread, but failed to maintain their race outside of their original home, with which South America was then connected. The most archaic of these marsupials is the celebrated Tasmanian wolf, or thylacine, which resembles in size and shape a pointer dog, but with a longer muzzle, and that long tail, which seems to be a general characteristic of the marsupialia. It is brownish-gray, with a row of darker bands crossing the hinder half of the back, and is one of the most swift-footed and savage hunters in the world. It is confined to Tasmania, where it became so destructive to sheep when the island was settled that it was killed off until almost exterminated. This island was the home, also, of another smaller beast, looking somewhat like a wolverine with the head of a hyena, which was so morose, savage, and untamable that the settlers named it Tasmanian Devil, and destroyed it as rapidly as they could. It hid by day in some rock den and made its forays at night. This truly diabolic creature belonged to the family of Dasyurus, which is represented in Australia by several small predatory beasts called native cats. They fill the role there of our northern martens and weasels, and most of their time is passed in trees, although some are fond of hunting amid rocks and brush. They like to come about ranches and villages, where they are the pest of poultry keepers, but are rarely domesticated, even partly. Another carnivorous group, Phascogales, contains the pouch mice, which are not mouse-like except in size, but have more the nature of shrews that live in trees and hunt birds, and any small creatures they can catch. Of the phalangers, a curious specimen is the wombat, named native bear by the early colonists, an animal about the size of our woodchuck, shaped like a miniature bear, and living mainly on roots, which it digs at night with its powerful claws. Its thick fur makes its skin valuable in market. Related to it structurally, but much like our gray squirrel in shape, and having an even longer and more bushy tail, is the charming sugar squirrel, which dwells in trees and sails in long flights from tree to tree in the twilights and on moonlight nights, just as do our flying squirrels. There are also tree phalangers so small they are called flying mice. Other tree-living phalangers are the opossums of Australia, whose soft gray pelts are exported in great numbers in foreign fur markets. The kangaroos and wallabies, Macropodidae, represent the highest development of the marsupial type and number some 50 species spread over all Australia and New Guinea. While the majority inhabit open grassy plains, others brushy districts and rocks, and a few dwell in trees. The kangaroos proper include half a dozen of the largest kinds, the commonest of which is the great grey boomer or forester of the colonists, often seen in menageries. It stands 4 to 5 feet tall, with a tail 30 to 36 inches long, but this size is considerably exceeded by that of the red or woolly kangaroo of the eastern and southern Australia. Furthermore, fossil remains show that in the Pleistocene era, kangaroos far bigger than even these existed there in numerous extinct species, one, for instance, whose skull alone measured nearly a yard in length. These animals take the place in Australia of the deer of northern countries. They are very gregarious and are always to be met with in droves. Each drove frequents a certain district and has its particular camping and feeding grounds. The animal has a dreadful weapon of defense in its powerful hind claw, which it can use like the tusk of a boar. The smaller kangaroos are called wallabies or brush kangaroos and frequent scrubs, jungles, and rocky places. These furnish most of the skins and leather sent to European markets, and like the big species of the plains, have been greatly reduced in numbers by hunters and sheep herders. Some of them are confined to the rough deserts and mountains, where they jump about the rocks with astonishing agility. One small genus includes the swift, hare-like species that resemble our jackrabbits in habits, and there are also the Dorca kangaroos, which are arboreal in habit and handsomely colored. Another group are rat-like in form, colors, and manners, running rather than leaping, and dwelling among scrub and grass, scratching the ground all day in search of the roots upon which they feed, and making havoc in the frontiersman's potato patches. Several kinds have prehensile tails, which they use apparently only to carry to their underground homes the long grass of which they make their beds. They associate in connected burrows like a rabbit warren. In the varied forms and functions they present, as beasts of prey, as grazers or root diggers, as ground-running, tree-climbing, burrowing, or cave-haunting forms, some solitary and slow, others agile and gregarious, the marsupial tribe in its isolated corner of the earth exhibits an epitome of the whole mammalian world. It shows in a conspicuous way how the necessity and habit of making a living in varied circumstances and exposed to lively competition, restricting every species to a particular manner, brings about a suitable modification of structure. The edentata, ant-eaters, sloths, and armadillos. At the base of the great division of Eutherian mammals, to which belong all that remain to be described, is found the order Edentata, toothless, whose modern representatives are few and unimportant in comparison with those of past ages, when gigantic ground sloths, armored glyptodons, and other fossil species flourished in a luxuriant world. The name is not well chosen, for many of these animals possess at least a few teeth, but always composed of vasodentine and not coated with enamel. Although the origin of this race is obscure, it was certainly far in the past, for its characters are archaic in many particulars, and its members are often far separated in structure and also in their geographical distribution. Two families belong to the Old World, one in the Orient and another in South Africa, but all the other edentates are American. The Oriental one includes most of the pangolins, or scaly anteaters, which are covered from head to foot in a coat of mail formed of overlapping horny plates, and can roll themselves into a ball that will defy any jaws not big enough to tear them to pieces, while the African family consists of the naked, long-nosed aardvark, ant bear, which burrows in the ground and cuts its way at night into the mud forts of termites and other ants in search of its favorite food. These two ancient creatures differ so much in their anatomy from the American edentates that they are classified by some naturalists in a separate order, Phodentia, and they differ almost as radically from one another. It should not be surprising to find most of the modern edentates in South America, since that is the most ancient and unchanged of all the continents, but a few sorts of anteaters, sloths, and armadillos alone remain where once their race in its heroic age dominated the world of its time. The puny survivors look and act like the relics they are. The great anteater, or tamandua, standing 18 inches or more in height, has flat-footed, bear-like hind feet, and short forelegs that end in huge claws bent under or backward, so that the animal walks on the outer face of its toes. Its tail is a great bushy mass of hair, with which the animal may cover itself as with a blanket, and its long neck tapers off into a head with a very long nose and little room for brains. The big claws are not used for burrowing an underground home, but for digging up the nest of ants and termites, which it licks up with its long, sticky tongue. When one realizes the enormous colonies of ants in the tropics, it is not amazing that so large an animal should subsist exclusively on these minute creatures. The claws are formidable weapons of defense also, the animal throwing itself on its back and defying the foe, or rising on its hind legs and giving a tearing, bear-like hug that even a man might well fear. This is a slow-moving creature, more fond of open country than forests, but the smaller tamandua belongs wholly to the woods and spends both days and nights in the treetops, tearing open the burrows and nests of arboreal insects and devouring their inhabitants and their stores of honey and young. A third species is the rare little yellow two-toed anteater of the Isthmus region, which appears to live almost wholly on wasp grubs. Much like these in organization are the two species of sloth, hairy creatures that hang all day long by their long, muscular limbs and 2 or 3 curved claws, underneath a branch of the tree through whose top they slowly creep about at night, collecting, crushing with their peg-like teeth, and swallowing the leaves that constitute their fare. Their long hair, naturally gray, becomes green by accumulating a coating of minute plants that thrive on it, and this helps to conceal the sloths amid the foliage. Yet they are killed by eagles and by all sorts of beasts of prey, against which they have no means of defense. These listless creatures are the degenerate descendants of a very long ancestries. The early tertiary rocks of Argentina contained bones of small sloth-like animals that apparently were ground dwellers and must have been active diggers. Later, that region became filled with larger ground sloths, apparently their descendants, that are believed to have browsed on bushes and trees, and some of these become the megateres of the late tertiary, which was as big as elephants. Similar giants inhabited North America. Even in the earliest days known to paleontologists, the anteater sloth group had become well separated from their fellow edentates, the armadillos, arguing a far preceding origin. In the later tertiary, the latter type developed such huge and heavily armored forms as the glyptodon, on whose bony shell the teeth of even the great saber-toothed tigers of the time could make little impression. These grotesque, tortoise-like glyptodons, of which there were a great variety, were vegetable eaters, and some survived to a time so recent that there is evidence that they were finally killed off by human hunters. Beside them were smaller armadillos, more like the modern ones, which are armored with overlapping belts of horny material between which coarse hairs sprout. But the amount of this armor varies greatly among the several species scattered from Patagonia to northern Mexico. In some it is a continuous shell, in others it consists of several belts, In still others is nearly absent. Armadillos are carnivorous, digging out worms, grubs, and the underground nests of wasps, catching insects of all sorts, stealing eggs and young from ground-nesting birds, killing serpents by leaping on them and sawing their bodies in two by means of the rough edges of their plates. In some places on the pampas, armadillo burrows are so numerous as to make riding dangerous. End of section 36.
Section 37 of Zoology, the Science of Animal Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Zoology, the Science of Animal Life by Ernest Ingersoll. The Gnawers. The great order Rodentia, rats, mice, rabbits, porcupines, squirrels, beavers, etc., derives its name from the Latin verb rodere, to gnaw or eat away something, and is characterized by the great development of the front or incisor teeth, by means of which rodents get their living by biting off, or gnawing through, the plants and woody stems on which they feed, or which they use in constructing their dwellings. All are primarily vegetable eaters, yet none will refuse a meal of flesh when opportunity offers to get it, and some are decidedly carnivorous, especially as to fish. They are distributed all over the world, including the Australian region. They are chiefly terrestrial, and often burrow or live in ready-made burrows. Some are aquatic, such as the voles. Others, like the squirrels, are arboreal. In perhaps a majority of the forms, the hind legs are much longer and stronger than the forelegs, giving the animals great leaping power, while the forefeet, with their long and flexible fingers, are constantly used as hands. Many are beautifully marked in varied tints of gray, brown, red, and black, so that their pelts have value in the fur market, and their flesh is an important element in human food. On the other hand, the activity of these animals, when numerous, cause serious damage to gardens, crops, and orchards, and one of them, the rat, is unquestionably the most dangerous animal to human health and prosperity in the whole animal kingdom. The fecundity of the smaller, murine species is great, and from time to time they increase inordinately in favorable places, and swarm abroad in vast and destructive migrations. Were it not for the fact that the rodents furnish the principal part of the food of predatory mammals, reptiles, and birds, and are thus kept down, the globe would soon become so populous with this tribe that hardly anything else could maintain existence. The distinguishing anatomical characteristic of the rodents is the dentition. The canines, so essential to carnivorous predatory animals, are here completely absent, and a long empty space intervenes between the incisors and the molars, or the cheek teeth, which vary greatly in number and form among the different families. The incisors consist of a single pair in each jaw, very large and strong, and composed of vasodentine, faced only with hard enamel, often yellow or red. As the softer substance behind the facing wears away more easily, the incisor takes a chisel shape, leaving the hard enamel in front projecting slightly as a cutting edge. Thus these teeth always remain sharp. The rodents are traced back in their lineage to the order of Tilodontia of the Eocene period. The oldest animal of modern type in the order is that of the squirrels. Let us begin with the rabbits and hares, family Leporidae. The name properly applies to the Old World species Lepus cuniculus, the burrowing wild rabbit from which all our various domestic rabbits are descended, whose special characteristic is the fact that they live in holes in the ground of their own digging, and in large colonies called warrens. All the other species make their breeding beds and resting places on the surface of the ground, in the best concealment, outside of forests, that they can find. Such a home is called the animal's form, and when it contains a litter of young, the mother covers them with a blanket of hair, which at that season she is shedding copiously. Strictly speaking, all the Leporidae, except the Cuniculus, are hares, but the general term rabbit is now so common that the scientific distinction is of no consequence. Europe and Asia have two kinds of hares, and several exist in this country, such as the familiar cottontail or bush rabbit of the East, the southern swamp rabbit, and several species of large, long-eared, swift-footed hares of the western plains called jackrabbits. The most important one, however, is the large northern one named snowshoe rabbit, because in winter it receives a broad growth of hair on the feet, aiding it in its traveling over the snow. This rabbit turns white in winter, the hairs losing their color with the advent of cold, as also does the big Arctic hare, which wanders as far north as land extends. These northern hares are the chief dependents for food in winter of all the Canadian fur-bearing animals, and indirectly of the native Indians. Consequently, when, as happens at intervals of a few years, the rabbits of a district all but wholly die off by an epidemic, a famine and dreadful distress occurs, or used to when civilized aid was less available than now, in northern Canada, and the commercial outcome of furs is greatly diminished. As the hares feed on herbage and bark, obtainable all the year round, they are abroad in winter, but they have a family of small cousins, the picas, or Lagomidae, that inhabit our western mountain tops above timberline and must hibernate. Other species abound in the Himalayas. They are small, short-eared, tailless creatures that make their homes in companies among loose rocks, and store in their deep crevices enough dried grass and flowering plants to keep themselves alive until the late spring of those cold heights. Western folks call them conies. The porcupines are large, plantigrade rodents, notable for the mixture of quill-like spines with the hair. This is most conspicuous in the European species, which bristles with spines reaching far beyond the hips and concealing the tail, forming an excellent defensive armor. Some smaller African and West Indian species are less well armed and have longer tails, at the end of which are tufts of spines, making an effective weapon. All of these pass their time and get their food on the ground. Our American porcupines, family Cercolabidae, differ somewhat anatomically and live for the most part in trees, although our common eastern porcupine wanders about a great deal in summer, especially at night, feeding on herbage, and rejoicing in a find of bones or other saline food here and there. It is defended by a coat of long black hair in which spines are plentifully mingled, and the short flat tail, covered with thick spines, may give a sideways stroke that makes a man or beast cautious about attacking an animal that otherwise seems so lethargic and helpless. The porcupines of this family, however, really belong to trees, where they slowly consume the foliage and tender bark, and remain quietly through even Canadian winters. The Pacific side of the country has a similar species in the yellow-haired porcupine, and several smaller kinds exist in Central and South America with scanty spines and long prehensile tails. Closely allied to the porcupines are the gregarious biscacas of the South American plains that live in villages of burrows, and much resemble prairie dogs in appearance and habits, also the chinchillas of the high levels of the Andes, whose soft gray coat is one of the prizes of the furrier. Here, too, come the swift-footed, slender agoutis and pacas of South America, many species of which exist and are useful as food, and a neighboring family contains the little cavies, from one of which are derived our pet guinea pigs, which are not pigs and do not come from Guinea. Also their cousin, the almost aquatic capybara, which measures 3 feet long, and so is the largest known rodent. This is much hunted for its flesh, and is the principal prey of the jaguar. This brings us to the worldwide tribe of rats and mice, formed by a group of 8 families, of which the typical one, Muridae, alone contains a third of all rodentia, and the other 7 creatures differing greatly from these familiar models. Many are small, such as the house mouse, originally a native of southeastern Asia, as also were the rats that commerce has carried all over the civilized globe. and the even tinier harvest mouse, gray or brown in plain color, and with long, slender, nearly hairless tails and legs, fairly equal in size. Thence in size they grade up to the stature of the rat, and from that on to the South African springhas, which is as big as a rabbit, and to our muskrat 2 feet long, counting in its tail. Although essentially alike in structure, some have varied widely from the original type. Thus the jerboas, several species of which inhabit the plains of Asia and Africa, have the hind legs so long that their bones are considerably longer than the distance from the root of the tail to the nose, and they progress in long rapid leaps, balancing themselves by long tails, often tufted at the end. The big jumping hare of South Africa has much the appearance of a kangaroo with a squirrel-like tail, and a genus of exquisitely dressed mice in our sandy southwest are called kangaroo mice. In fact, one of our commonest reddish field mice, found all over the country, has similar proportions, and is remarkable for its long leaps when hurried. A shortening of the tail is seen in the voles, to which the common meadow mouse of various species belong, and still more in the lemmings, in the Old World mole rats, and in our pouch gophers. All these are not only ground-keeping kinds, but burrowers, and have no use for a long tail, save in the case of the muskrat, which is really a big vole that has taken to an aquatic life, and needs an oar to scull himself through the water. For muskrats swim more by means of their tails than by their feet. The foremost burrowers are the pouch gophers, whose long tunnels and food-getting do so much damage to crops in the Central Plains region of this country. They must be distinguished from the ground squirrels, also called gophers. An interesting diversity of habits may be met with here. Some rodents live in deeply excavated burrows, others in shallow diggings or holes in stumps and rock crevices. Some, like the water voles, reside in holes in the banks of streams, or, like the muskrat, heap up houses in a marsh in which to pass the winter in security, while still others construct ball-like nests among the herbage or in bushes and trees. Some truly hibernate in cold countries, like the famous dormouse of Europe, and our equally sound sleeper, the American jumping mouse. But mostly they stay in snug habitations and live through the winter on collections of food, or, like field mice, gather seeds abroad even in the coldest weather, or poke about under the snow for food, as do the lemmings. From time to time certain species, especially of the short-tailed field mice and the lemmings, multiply excessively in some district, and then are forced to spread away from their birthplace in those migrations of myriads which form the plagues that devastate large tracts of country. They march on until an accumulation of enemies and an epidemic of illness combine to kill them off. Squirrels, woodchucks, and beavers. Squirrels in form and activities are much alike all over the world, and are absent only from Australia and Madagascar. The long bushy tail that makes so excellent a blanket, as it is wrapped about their bodies when curled up asleep, is the badge and pride of the tribe. They inhabit hollows in the trees, or sometimes holes among their roots, and in summer make globular nests of leaves and twigs in which the young are nursed and trained. Nuts form their staple food, but berries, fruits, roots, funguses, insect grubs, etc., offer changes in fare with the recurring seasons. Sometimes great ingenuity is displayed in getting at this food. Some species are errant robbers of birds' nests, and now and then kill and eat small birds and mammals, and the older males are resolutely kept away from their babies by the mothers for fear of cannibalism. This catholic appetite, and their willingness to wander from place to place in search of things seasonable, enable squirrels to find food of some sort every month of the year. Yet most species have the forethought to lay up in more or less secret places a winter supply of provender. Consequently, no species of Sciurus hibernates, strictly speaking. This storing of winter provender is a matter that has been regarded with more general interest perhaps than any other feature of animal economy, and is mainly manifested among the rodents, although practiced in a limited way by some others, as for instance by weasels and foxes. It looks like conscious foresight of the famine time to come, but it is no doubt in the main, if not wholly, instinctive, since the young, who have had no experience of the winter scarcity or imprisonment ahead, make suitable preparations. It seems to me that this habit, so necessary to the existence of small vegetarian creatures in cold climates, arose in some such way as this. The little animals that store supplies designed to keep them alive through the winter are those whose food is for one reason or another unobtainable then. Remember also that they are feebly endowed with powers either for defense or for escape outside their homes, and when gathering their food, must not loiter much to eat as they go, but must pick up what they can carry and hasten to the safety of their doorways. This is the reason why surviving species of such animals have acquired cheek pouches, in which they can transport a fair meal of their food to be eaten at home at leisure. During the larger part of the year, food is scant, and these rodents get into the way of picking up every bit they can find, and seem so restless and energetic that some of them, such as the viscachas and rats, accumulate about their burrows or nests quantities of inedible things, moved apparently by mere objectless acquisitiveness. The search for food, the foremost occupation and anxiety of these small wood folk, would be increasingly stimulated as the ripening season of the seeds and nuts on which they depend advanced, and the impulse to incessant industry, so necessary in the poorer parts of the year, would now be overworked, and each animal, in his haste to be up and doing, would constantly bring home more food than would be consumed, so that it would be piled up in the accustomed dining room. The gradual failure of outdoor supplies as winter came on would lead to the eating, with increased frequency, of those fragments casually saved in and about the burrow or house, which from their nature would not have decayed. The animal which had been most busy and clever in food gathering would own the largest amount of the leavings of these autumnal feasts. Having the most food, he would be among those of the colony or neighborhood strongest and most likely to survive, and to give to his offspring the tendency to strength and industry which had been his salvation. This would be continued and shaped by the process of natural selection into a valuable, instinctive habit of gathering non-perishable food in large quantities every autumn, and thus providing themselves with stores to last through the coming winter. But it does not follow that the squirrels and mice are conscious of this wise forethought. The striped, chattering, ever-busy chipmunks, of which America possesses several delightful species, although able to ascend into trees, and frequently doing so, are groundlings, and fond of rocky places, into whose crevices they can quickly rush when an enemy is seen or heard. Hence their fondness for the stone walls that in the east divide farm fields, and in general they are more inclined to associate with man and his works than are the tree squirrels, although the grays lend themselves readily to the semi-domestication of residence in village streets and city parks, as the red never does. The chipmunks dig long underground tunnels, enlarged here and there into chambers serving as bedrooms, storerooms for food, and refuse bins, and the northwestern species are so numerous that between what they eat and waste in gardens and grain fields and the bad runways for water their galleries make, they are justly regarded as a pest. These pretty but troublesome chipmunks are called gophers in some parts of the West, but that name is more generally given to the gray or brownish ground squirrels of the plains, classified as spermophiles by naturalists, and they are so varied, numerous, and destructive wherever grain is grown, from the prairies of Kansas and Nebraska to the California valleys, and northward to the Saskatchewan, that extensive and costly poisoning operations are necessary to suppress them. Similar to them, but larger, are the prairie dogs, whose communities or towns of burrows and tunnels render useless large tracts of land in the southern half of the plains. Very similar animals to these abound in Russia and eastward throughout the open country of Central Asia. They have undoubtedly increased much within late years through the killing off of the natural enemies that in the old days held their multiplication in check. The prairie dogs used to be called marmots. a term that applies more properly to some larger European burrowing rodents and to our woodchucks, which are so common all over the eastern half of the country, and in another species on the summits of the northern Rockies, where they are known as whistlers. The most remarkable thing about them is the length and intensity of their dormancy in hibernation. There remains only the beaver, the largest of the rodents except the capybara, and altogether the most important one, measured by the value of its fur, and by the service its race has done through thousands of years of preparing, by its clearings and dams, valleys for man's cultivation. Every beaver settlement is a true colony, the offspring of some previous settlement, which may be hundreds of years old. When such a settlement becomes too populous for the food supply, young males and their mates travel to some fresh spot by a small woodland stream and begin life by digging a burrow in the bank with an underwater entrance, and at once dam up the stream by piling sticks, sod, and mud across its current at some favorable spot below their home, the effect, if not the conscious purpose, of which is to maintain a depth of water in the stream at all seasons, sufficient to cover the entrance to the burrow, and also to permit the storage of green wood under water and ice, near the home for food. They eat the bark during the next winter. Young beavers born that season will remain through the winter with the parents, and a dome-like home is usually built in which the family lives. Next season the young set up a home for themselves nearby, and so the colony grows. Beavers get most of their food by cutting down trees other than evergreens and gnawing the bark. As the trees disappear near the bank and the colony increases, the dam is enlarged so as to spread the setback water over a wider territory, and later canals are cut deep into the woods, permitting faraway trees to be felled and their pieces floated to the houses, especially in gathering the supply for winter. Old dams are sometimes 100 or more yards long, and are built with astonishing intelligence with reference to holding back a great breadth of water. These are diligently and skillfully repaired, and the houses become, in the course of years, big enough to accommodate 3 generations of beavers at once, and are so massive, especially when frozen in winter, which is the time of most danger from their enemies, that they are practically safe from attack. From such a mature colony, others are gradually formed, until in a level swampy region the whole district is well occupied by beavers. This is possible now, of course, only in the remote Northwest, but a few beavers survive in the Rocky Mountain region of the United States under protective laws, and are still numerous in the more thinly settled parts of Canada, and furnish a large return to trappers. End of section 37.
Section 38 of Zoology, the Science of Animal Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Zoology, the Science of Animal Life by Ernest Ingersoll. Mammals of the Sea. Whale is a general name for the extensive and varied order of marine mammals termed in science Cetacea. The origin is obscure, but it is certain that their very ancient ancestors were land animals, evidence of which is afforded by their anatomy, especially in embryonic and very young specimens. Here are classified not only the great true whales, but their smaller relatives, the sportive dolphins and porpoises, the grampuses or blackfish, the white whales often seen in the lower St. Lawrence River, the killers, and such out-of-the-way forms as the narwhal, from whose snout projects a long twisted tusk, which is a strangely overgrown incisor tooth. In all these animals the shape is fish-like, as is required by the fish-like habits. The skin is smooth and usually blackish, or black with white markings. The forelimbs have become paddles, and their tail is a pair of horizontal flukes. As they are mammals with lungs and breathe air, whales must come to the surface frequently for that purpose. At the instant they emerge, the pent-up air is expelled from the lungs through the nostrils at the top of the nose. In the case of the larger species, this big discharge of moist breath condenses in the cold air into a visible vapour, often mixed with sea spray, which is called a blowing, but no water is expelled from the mouth, with which the blowholes have no connection. The smaller kinds of cetaceans, of which the variety is immense, are in the main fish-eaters, but the killer seizes and devours porpoises and seals also, and a band of them may unite to worry a big cachalot to death. Most species go about in small bands, or schools. The great whales are of two distinct families. 1. Baleen whales, and 2. Toothed whales. The first take their name from the blade-shaped plate of horny material, whalebone, hanging, to the number of 200 or 300, from the roof of the mouth, each central blade 8 or 10 feet long in ordinary cases. These right, i.e. proper, whales, as they are called by the men who hunt for and harpoon them, are huge creatures often 50 to 75 feet long, ranging all northern oceans, even amid Arctic ice. Yet, despite their bulk, they feed exclusively on the small crustaceans and other minute creatures of the plankton swept into the mouth by the millions as the whale rushes along the surface, the water scooped up escaping from the sides of the mouth, and the food being caught by the fringes of baleen and swallowed like a continuous meal. In addition to the whalebone obtained from these whales, the hunters cut away and save the thick layer of fat, blubber, under the skin for the sake of the oil it yields. The beef-like flesh of the muscles is good meat. This kind of whale is becoming very scarce. The toothed whale consists of the single species called sperm whale, or cachalot, which is of a gigantic size, a lesser cousin, Kogia, and an inferior genus. The beaked whales of the Antarctic. All are more common in the tropics and South Pacific than elsewhere. The great sperm whale differs in form from a right one, mainly in having a huge, flat-topped, almost square-fronted head, beneath which is hinged a somewhat shorter underjaw. The carnivorous mouth is armed with strong, pointed teeth, and these whales prey on fish and especially on cuttlefish. They can swallow whole nothing larger than a salmon, but can bite larger prey into manageable pieces, and have more than once seized and crushed a boat in their jaws. The cachalot attacks the giant squid whenever it meets one, and the marks of the squid's winding arms and cruel suckers are often seen on the hides of whales as scars of some struggle between these titans of the deep. The value of mankind of the sperm whale lies in the liquid fat and the valuable substance, spermaceti, that fill a vast cavity in the top of its skull, a single whale yielding several barrels of it, from which the commercial spermaceti and a fine oil are extracted. In their intestines are frequently found lumps of the secretion known as ambergris, used as a base for perfumes, the price of which is so high in the market that a few pounds will cover the expenses of a ship's voyage. Ambergris is also found floating in the open sea or cast upon the shore, and for a long time its origin was unknown. End of section 38, read by Inkell.
Section 39 of Zoology, the Science of Animal Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Helen. Zoology, the Science of Animal Life by Ernest Ingersoll. The World's Herds and Flocks. The great tribe of animals called ungulata, hoofed, or herbivora, eaters of herbivores, combines two types of structure into which they have diverged since their origin at the dawn of the Tertiary era, namely 1. Odd-toed or solid-hooved ungulates, perissodactyla, typified by horses, and 2. Even-toed or split-hooved ungulates, artiodactyla, typified by cattle. They exist in every part of the habitable globe except Australasia, have furnished sustenance to the larger Carnivora, and have supplied the need for man for his assistance in his labour, and with materials for food, shelter, and clothing. Without them, modern civilization would have been impossible. Both divisions have lost the plantigrade, flat-soled walk of their early ancestors, and now step on the tips of their toes. This has been gradually gained as an adaptation to the increase of dry land and the formation of grassy plains, which we know went on steadily, especially through the last third of the Tertiary era. The short, massive legs and spreading, five-toed feet, useful in sustaining an animal's weight in marshes, were slowly changed to longer, more slender limbs and a digitigrade walk, as greater speed and nimbleness were required in making their way over wide pastures, to and from watering places, or in escaping the beasts of prey, which were themselves becoming swifter and more active in jumping by coordinate evolution of abilities. But before proceeding to the typical hoof tribes, mention must be made of the elephants, which belong in this order. Elephants appear to stand apart from all other mammals, and from the earliest of times have attracted attention by their huge bulk and strength, and by traditions of their intelligent performances. They seem a necessary part of our ideas of Oriental life and grandeur, and a circus without trick elephants would be a poor show in the eyes of the American youngster. The naturalist classifies them, order Proboscidea, in this place because they are plainly, although remotely, related in structure to the solid-hoofed browsers. But only recently has he been able to trace their ancestry back to a small, tapir-like forefather of the Miocene days, with no trunk and no tusks. The trunk, of course, is the animal's lengthened nose, become an organ useful for many purposes other than breathing, and the tusks are overgrown upper incisor teeth. The elephants of the present time are few compared with those of warmer past ages, when many species, as well as various cousins, such as long-haired mammoths and towering mastodons, wandered over Europe, Asia, and our own country. Now, only two kinds remain, one in Africa, the other Asiatic. They differ in many ways, most noticeably in the size of their ears, which in the African elephant are very much larger than those of the Asiatic species. Both are forest animals, feeding on leaves and twigs. African elephants were formerly to be found all over the wooded parts of that continent, travelling about in herds that sometimes numbered 100 or more individuals, and were varied in appearance, some being taller than any oriental one, while others, in the Congo region, are so small as to be called dwarfs. The natives have never captured and made use of them, and few have been tamed by anyone within recent years, but in the time of the Carthaginians and Romans they were held captive, ridden, and employed in war, and in sports of the arena. They have been greatly reduced in numbers by ivory hunters, and would be nearly or quite extinct now had they not been protected in recent years by wise laws. The Asiatic or Indian elephant, which is confined to India, Ceylon, Burma, and the Malay countries, still roams the jungles as a wild animal, but every herd is known to and protected by the local governments, and from time to time these are rounded up and young ones are captured and trained to man's service. Only in this way can the domestic supply be maintained, since these elephants rarely produce young when in captivity. They are utilized as riding and burden-bearing beasts for hauling heavy loads, especially in the army service, and in handling large timber and other industrial operations. Some ivory is obtained from this species, but the tusks are far smaller than those of the African elephants, and the females bear none at all. While both sexes are armed in Africa, where an old bull's tusks have been known to exceed a weight of 300 pounds each. Although there is no reason to suppose the African elephant is less intelligent by nature than the Oriental one, nearly all evidence of thoughtfulness in these animals comes from Indian examples, a species that has been studied and educated for hundreds of years. That they may be taught to do almost anything of which their bodies are capable is plain, but undoubtedly they comprehend very largely the purposes of the man directing them, and use brains in assisting him to carry them out. They have retentive memories, appreciate kindness, and constantly show skill and discretion in accomplishing what they are asked to do. In regard to no other sort of animal has so much been written as of elephants, and the sum of the testimony is that they are not only very teachable and faithful in performing their tasks when not disabled by fear, but often use surprisingly good judgment in their work. Distantly related to the elephants, yet so remote in relationship to anything else as to be set apart in an order, Hyracoidea, by themselves, and with no visible geological ancestry, are the queer little conies of the scriptures, called rock rabbits, and dassies in South Africa. They have a singular resemblance to rabbits, apart from their little round ears, and are more like enlarged copies of our western pikas, but their anatomy and teeth show that they are far from being rodents, and they are classified here mainly by reason of their rhinoceros-like teeth and their hooflets on their toes, so that they form a quaint intermediary between the elephants and the solitooth section of the ungulates. They are, indeed, relics of an exceedingly primitive and ancestral type of ungulates. Rhinoceroses, tapirs, and horses. Included by their general anatomy among the cerasodactyls, although they have several toes on each foot, all reaching the ground, and, like those of elephants, connected by webs and clothed with thick, hoof-like nails, are the rhinoceroses and tapirs. The rhinoceroses are relics of a long and interesting geological history. 2 belong to Africa, one of which, the common black browsing rhinoceros, is still abundant south of the equator in all the more open and less occupied parts of the continent, while the other, the larger, square-lipped, grass-eating, or white rhinoceros, has become very rare save in certain remote and upland plains. Both have thick, hairless skins of a pale lead grey, which lie smoothly over the whole body, and both have, on the nose, 2 horns composed of matted, whalebone-like hairs, not a part of the skeleton, but springing from the skin. The front horn is always much the longer, in some cases reaching a length of more than 50 inches. Asia has 3 species of rhinoceros, all of which differ from the African in having functional incisor teeth and in their hides. The best known is the Indian rhinoceros, now confined to the hot jungles of the extreme northeast of India. It has only 1 horn, and its dark hide is thrown into heavy folds looking like artificial armour. It became known to Europe in the early 16th century, and became the subject for some of the most curious speculations and superstitions of that credulous age. The Sondike, or hairy rhinoceros, still is to be found in jungles from Bengal around to the end of the Malayan Peninsula. It is smaller than the Indian one, and its folded and tessellated hide supports a coat of short hair. Its horns are only 2 little protuberances on its nose. Finally, Sumatra and Borneo have a rhinoceros whose coat is still more hairy, and among whose peculiarities is the possession of 2 formidable horns. These creatures are perhaps the best examples remaining of what Merck's rhinoceros, fossil, and other big quadrupeds of the Pleistocene era looked like. The tapirs are even more widely separated in habitat than the rhinoceroses, for 4 species dwell in the New World between Guatemala and southern Brazil and Guyana, while the 5th belongs to Malaysia. They are forest animals, mainly browsers, the long, almost trunk-like nose and lips enabling them to seize and tear off leaves and twigs easily. They choose low districts as a rule, and rush into the safety of water when in danger from the jaguar or other beasts. They are shaped somewhat like a very fat pony, but with a big, pointed head, and are clothed with short hair of plain dark tints, but the young are spotted at first. They are timid, secretive, and nocturnal in their habits. Their flesh is excellent meat. This brings us to the horses, whose geological history is one of the romances of natural history, and it is traced from the little 5-toed Eohippus of the Eocene up to the herds that roamed our western prairies, and disappeared so completely and so unaccountably in the era just preceding the present. Our domestic horses, consequently, are all of Old World origin. As far back as man can be traced in his supposed birthplace in Central Asia, herds of small horses fed upon those high plains. And about 50 years ago, bands of ponies were discovered ranging the dreary deserts of the Dzungaria, or northwest Chinese Turkestan, and specimens are now living and breeding in the Zoological Park in New York and in European collections. This truly wild horse stands about 10 hands high and is covered with thick hair of a dull brown colour, unstriped. Such horses were undoubtedly hunted and killed as food by Paleolithic men, and when many thousands of years ago they had in some degree domesticated them, and began to migrate southward and westward, they took these horses with them. Those people that gradually occupied Persia, Mesopotamia, and the plains of Arabia and North Africa developed them into riding animals that became perfected in what we know as the Arabian horse. Those tribes that migrated across Russia and along to the northern shore of the Mediterranean found in Europe a similar but more robust horse, now designated the forest horse, which the savages regarded as game. The 2 interbred in the course of time, but the southern breeds have remained smaller, lighter, and more agile, while the northern or forest stock has been the foundation of the heavy draught horses of northern Europe. After the Crusades, Arab blood was introduced to effect a still further refinement of the horses of southern Europe, and it was from this Arab improved stock, prevalent in Spain, that the horses sent to the Spanish colonies in the Americas were derived. Our plains, and the pampas of South America, soon became populated with these horses run wild, mustangs, showing even yet traces of their aristocratic lineage. So near to the horses that they belong to the same genus, Equus, are the zebras, which differ mainly in their brighter colouring, less bushy tail, roached manes, and lack of those callosities called chestnuts on the hind legs. The zebras are exclusively African and include two types, a southern and a northern. The true zebra, now extinct, except where kept and bred in captivity, belonged to the mountains near the Cape of Good Hope, was only about 12 hands high, and had black stripes on a white ground. In the more open parts of Africa, north to Lake Rudolph, roamed Burchell's variety of this zebra, the one now commonly seen in menageries, in which the coat is creamy or golden yellow, and the black stripes are far broader. Its northern variety, Grevy zebra, has the black stripes narrower, but so much more numerous that the white shows as mere lines between them. To these must be added an extinct species, killed off many years ago by Boer farmers and other sportsmen, which was known as the quagga, from its barking neigh. It was a dark brown, with stripings only on the head and neck. The zebras seem incapable of becoming useful in harness or under the saddle, but their very near relative, the asses, in spite of the sober grey of their dress and the ungainly ears, have given us the patient and enduring donkey, which has been a servant of mankind, at least in Egypt, ever since the date of the earliest monuments. And wild asses still flourish on the deserts of Africa, from Algiers to Somaliland. Another somewhat larger and more variable species roams the upland plains of Persia and northern India, whilst a variety, the Kiang, lives on the Arctic tableland of Tibet, and is as untamable as a creature can be imagined. Hippos, pigs, and camels. With the hippopotamus, we begin the long list of the artiodactyls, or cloven-footed animals, in which the weight of the body rests equally on the two central digits, third and fourth, which are alike in development, while the second and fifth digits, when present, do little or no work, except in the hippopotamus, whose outside toes are as long as the central ones, because needed by an animal treading on muddy soil and accustomed to swimming. Although this huge marsh denizen is now confined to Africa, it ranged into southern Europe and eastward to India within quite recent times, but was destroyed by the human settlement of these countries, and civilization will in due time exterminate it from the Congo and Nile basins, where it now is so numerous and so incompatible with their commerce and industry. The swine are the first artiodactyls to show the typical cloven feet, and in them the two hind toes reach almost to the ground, so as to help the footing in the soft ground that they frequent. The foremost member of the family Suidae is the wild boar of the Old World, known from the North Sea to the Bay of Bengal, and it is hard to realise that the fat hogs of our stockyards are modifications of this bristling forest boar, with his muscular form, swift gait, and terrible tusks. Far more ugly in appearance, however, is the warthog of Africa, and the hairless babirusa of Celebes, whose upcurved tusks far outmeasure those of the Indian boar. America has a family of native swine named peccaries, small, thin-legged grizzly black pigs with very thick, bristly necks and large, angular heads. They have wicked little eyes, razor-sharp tusks in both jaws, and no visible tails, and the young are not striped, as in the typical Suidae. These pigs go in companies, wandering mainly at night in search of food, and taking almost anything edible. They are irascible, attack with fierce energy in concert, and are formidable foes to anything afoot, driving even the jaguar up a tree when the band turns on him. One kind of peccary is common in southwestern Texas, and its roving bands do much damage by night to crops and gardens. It is called a javelin. The swine occupy a somewhat intermediate place between the solid-toothed and the split-toothed sections of the herbivora, and the stomach is simple except in the peccaries, where it takes a complicated form that approaches that of the ruminants. This simplicity, with the correlated fact that swine do not chew the cud, enabled the leaders of the ancient Hebrews to set pigs apart as unclean by a more general definition than a mere name could give, thus leaving no way of escape for those who might be inclined to dodge the prohibition by quibbling. All other herbivora are ruminants, that is, chewers of the cud, those who gather and swallow their food in haste, and then at leisure recover it and thoroughly re-chew it in small quantities, cuds. This strange operation, like the carrying away of food by pocket mice, monkeys, etc., enabled these comparatively defenseless animals to gather nutriment in a short time and then retreat to a safe place to prepare it for digestion. Associated with this practice is a large, complicated stomach, normally consisting of 4 chambers, into the first and largest of which the hastily swallowed forage is first received. Then, when swallowed a second time, it passes on into the second or true stomach, where real digestion begins. End of section 39.
Section 40 of Zoology, the Science of Animal Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Zoology, the Science of Animal Life, by Ernest Ingersoll. The World's Herds and Flocks, continued. Camels, deer, giraffes, and pronghorns. This is a rather miscellaneous group introducing the typical herbivora. The most ancient of them in the style of their structure are certain little spotted creatures, like miniature deer in appearance, that inhabit the forests of western Africa and the Orient, and are known as chevrotains. The fact that in their metapodical bones they resemble the structure of camels causes these apparently so distant animals to be placed next to camels in classification. The history of camels, Camelidae, is very similar to that of the horse. The family originated in North America, where it developed from little creatures by changes and adaptations to a life on dry uplands, as did the horses, into a species which in the Pleistocene was a third larger than any now living. Meanwhile camels had made their way over the land which in the later Tertiary connected Alaska with Siberia, into the high plains of Asia, where the camels found favourable circumstances and developed into the 2 species we know. Others migrated, earlier in the family history, into South America, where they ceased to grow tall after the camel model, and became the huanacos of Patagonia, of which the llamas, are prehistorically domesticated descendants, and into the woolly vicuñas of the Andean mountains. Modern camels are of 2 kinds, the single-humped and the double-humped. The latter, or Bactrian, is confined to Asia and is able to endure the cold and snows in the tablelands of that continent, where its burdens are carried in winter as well as summer. What was the extent to which the single-humped or ordinary camel ranged before its prehistoric enslavement by men, we do not know. If it roamed the deserts of Arabia and northern Africa as well as those of Turkestan, no evidence of it remains. A few small-sized, gaunt, wary, and swift-footed camels still run wild among the almost inaccessible sand dunes of the Gobi Desert, but it is not certain that they are relics of the original wild stock. At any rate, the camels have always been creatures of the world's waste places, and all their quaint peculiarities, such as their sole pads and the water-storing sacs in their stomachs, rumens, are adaptations to their desert home. The deer family, Cervidae, is of great extent, and worldwide in its distribution, except that it is entirely absent from Africa and Australia. In none are more than 2 toes of use in walking. The second and 5th toe hangs at some distance behind and above the functional hoofs, which are narrow and pointed. All have slender, long legs, giving swiftness and great leaping power, and very short tails, with the exception of the rare and peculiar David's deer of China, whose tail is almost like that of a cow. The coat of hair is short and brittle, reddish-brown and foxy in summer, greyer in winter, in some species plain, or spotted only when fawns, in others variegated with small, whitish spots. The distinctive badge of the family, however, is the pair of horns borne on the heads of the males, also by females in the reindeer and caribou. Collectively, and more properly called antlers, since they are not composed of horn, but are of true bony material. They are posed on 2 protuberances on the top of the skull, where in spring arises a growth of fleshy material, covered with velvety hair, that rapidly takes the shape of the antler characteristic of the species, and age, of the deer, and as it grows is filled with lime salts that gradually replace all the tissues. Then the velvet dries and scales off, and the ivory-like antler emerges. This remains as a serviceable weapon and ornament of the buck until the beginning of winter, when its attachment to the skull loosens, and the antler drops off. This happens annually in the case of all deer, one of the common and universal facts in zoology that many find it hard to believe. The horns of the various deer vary in size from short and simple spikes to the wide-branching antlers of the moose and wapiti, but these last are acquired only when the buck is fully matured. The yearling shows only a spike, and acquiring branches, tines, one by one annually as he grows until his proper complement is reached, but in a few small species no branching ever occurs. The family contains many genera and species, but only the most noticeable can be mentioned. The most familiar one, probably, is the small, spotted fallow deer of southern Europe, bands of which ornament the parks of grand estates in Great Britain and on the Continent. Its antlers broaden at the end into the form known as palmated, on account of its resemblance to an open hand with fingers. Even more celebrated in song and story is the red deer, the males of which are stags, and the females hinds. These are large, dark, reddish-brown animals, with grandly symmetrical antlers, every tine, or point, on which, 7 on each side, in a full head, had its name in the language of hunting. This deer, still wild in the highlands of Scotland and in the mountainous forests of eastern Europe, is also to be found right across Asia, where local varieties go by the names of maral in northern Persia, hangul in Kashmir, and so on to eastern Siberia, where far taller species live than are known to Europe, and all vary in minor particulars only from our wapiti, which it is fair to regard as of the same stock. None of all these stags is more stately than the American wapiti, the elk of all western men, which once abounded from the Adirondacks and southern Alleghenies to California and the borders of Alaska. Everywhere of old it was plentiful and easy to kill, and the pioneers swiftly destroyed it as civilization was pushed westward, until its mighty herds have vanished almost as completely as those of the bison. It thrived anywhere and everywhere, climbing the wooded heights of the Appalachians, where the very last one was killed near Ridgeway, Pennsylvania, in 1869, loafing in the warm, well-watered valleys of the Mississippi basin, herding in the sun-baked plains, or scrambling up and down the roughest of western Sierras. Equally broad in its appetite, those that browsed or ate mast and fruits in the eastern woods did no better than those which grazed on the bunch-grass plateaus from the Rio Grande to Peace River, and in winter it would keep fat where other deer or cattle might starve, because able to paw through the snow to the dried grass. The other round-horned deer of the United States are the familiar Virginian, white-tailed, or willow deer, which is to be found all over the country, and in similar species in Mexico and Central America. The larger black-tailed, long-eared mule deer, or jumping deer, of the plains and the foothills of the Rocky Mountain region, and the small, forest-keeping, black-tail, or Columbian deer of the Oregon and northward. Canada, Alaska, and the northern parts of Maine and Minnesota are the refuge of that biggest of all the deer, which we call the Indian name moose, but which is known to Europeans as elk, for it is a circumpolar species that once roamed in great numbers through the woods of all Europe, and in the country far southward along the Appalachians. Until the World War the elk was preserved in certain large forests of Lithuania and central Russia, but it is doubtful if any survived the desolation of that region during and after the war. The moose is everywhere a forest-ranging animal, especially fond of regions where rivers and lakes abound, in which it finds desirable food in summer and takes much pleasure, yet in the mountainous west it often climbs to the high and dry heights. Its principal diet is leaves and twigs, pulled off by the long, flexible lips that are so characteristic a feature. The moose is a huge, immensely strong and ungainly animal, blackish-brown with pale legs and belly, and with a neck so short that it can graze only by kneeling. A very large bull may stand 6½ to 7 feet high at the withers, which, with the neck, are clothed in a thick mantle of long, coarse, stiff hair, and from the throat hangs a large hairy strip of dewlap skin, the bell, which in old age draws up into a sort of pouch. The long and narrow head ends in an overhanging, flexible muzzle that may be curled around a twig like a proboscis. On the massive head and neck the bull carry a wonderful pair of flattened antlers, always surprisingly wide and spread, but varying greatly in weight, and that irrespective of the relative bigness of the animal. The moose of the Kenai Peninsula, Alaska, are famous for the immensity and complication of their horns, once preserved in the Field Columbian Museum, Chicago, have a spread of 78½ inches, show 34 points, measure 15 inches around the burr, and with a dry skull weigh 93 pounds, but very few reach such dimensions. Another flat-horned deer is the famous reindeer of the boreal regions of both hemispheres, for our Arctic caribou are the same animals under another name. No truly wild reindeer now exist in the Old World, but they are scattered over all the barren grounds, or treeless coast areas and islands, from Greenland to Alaska, and the Eskimos depend on them not only for food to some extent, but even more for clothing and tentage. Every autumn enormous herds of these caribou, gathered in migration, sweep southward to less frigid and snowy feeding grounds in the region between Hudson Bay and Great Slave Lake, and there enable the Indians to provide themselves with meat and skins for the winter. These Arctic caribou feed mainly on the lichen called reindeer moss. Another kind, the woodland caribou, inhabits the uncivilized forest borders south of the Barren Grounds, and the mountain regions from British Columbia to the Arctic shore of Alaska and Yukon, and in the east occurs in Ungava, Labrador, Newfoundland, and New Brunswick. They are not regularly migratory, but wander in small herds, prefer swampy woods, and their habitats approach those of the moose. There is no great difference otherwise between them and the Arctic caribou, but they vary a good deal, so that several species have been named among those of the West, one of which, in Alaska, is quite white. Southeastern Asia has many kinds of deer, such as the large stag-like sambar of India and eastward, the spotted axis, or chital, the sika of Japan, and a variety of small oriental species exist. The giraffes of equatorial Africa, family Giraffidae, are closely related to the deer. They are hornless, but from the top of the skull project two protuberances, several inches in length, which answer to the horn cords of the deer, but carry no antlers, and are permanently covered with hairy skin. Between them is a third, shorter protuberance of the skull. A few years ago it was discovered that there existed in the dense forests of the lower Congo Valley an animal of this family, but smaller and more antelope-like in body, and without the towering characteristics of the giraffe, called by the pygmies of that district okapi, or oapi. It is chestnut in colour, with yellowish cheeks and the legs marked with wavy, whitish stripes. It is perhaps not rare, but it is exceedingly difficult to obtain in the dense jungle it inhabits. Two singular animals remain to be mentioned here, as standing intermediate between the deer and the cattle family, next to be considered. One of these is the musk deer of the Himalayas, from which is taken the pod, or ventral gland, that contains the odorous substance, musk. This is a strange, old-fashioned, solitary little creature, the size of a half-grown kid, and having very large ears, almost no tail, and no horns, but wearing a pair of keen weapons in the long upper canines, which hangs well down below the lower jaw. The four toes of the feet are almost equal, and the hoofs so free that they can fairly grasp any projection, so that the animal is a marvel of agility and sure-footedness. Our American pronghorn, antelope, is the second of these intermediate animals, and is not far removed in its structure from our white mountain goat. It foreshadows the sheathed horned ruminants, but differs from all of them in the fact that its horns bear a prong, and also in that they are periodically shed and renewed. This beautiful and graceful little animal, truly antelope-like in form and habit, stands about 3 feet high at the shoulder, has slender legs and feet, with no false hoofs, and is exceedingly swift in its bounding gait. It is now almost gone from the wide plains where only a few years ago it was to be seen in summer from the Saskatchewan to the Rio Grande and southward. In the autumn it would gather in the north into ever-increasing herds that swept southward to pass the winter in Texas and New Mexico, and then would return northward with the advance of spring. The extension of fenced ranching, but most of all the spanning of the plains by railroads, rapidly put an end to these migrations, and the wasteful killing of the pronghorns in sport, or as food, completed the virtual extermination of one of the most interesting and desirable animals of the New World. End of section 40, read by Inkell. Section 41 of Zoology, the Science of Animal Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Zoology, the Science of Animal Life, by Ernest Ingersoll. Some supremely useful animals. The fact that likeness of structure, which compels naturalists to group certain animals into a family in spite of possible unlikeness in size or form, is accompanied by resemblance in quality, is well illustrated by the family Bovidae, Latin boves, cattle, which includes goats, sheep, antelopes, and oxen. For all of these in flesh, products, and disposition are alike suited to the requirements of men, and especially of mankind in a social civilization. This family of animals furnishes us with nearly all of our milk, butter, and cheese, with flesh food, woolen clothing, leather goods, horn, gelatin, etc., and it gives us such servants as the ox and goat, while sportsmen find in it the most fascinating of their larger game. The distinctive feature of this most useful of animal tribes is the possession of hollow horns, properly so called. Horn is a chitinous material developed from the skin, are not dissimilar to hair. Indeed, it would be no great stretch of facts to say that a cow's horn was composed of agglutinated hairs. These horns are sheaths that grow over cores of bone, outgrowths of the skull, increase in size until the wearers are mature, grow at the base as fast as worn at the tips, and are never shed. They may be borne by the males alone, or by both sexes, or the males may have horns far larger than those of the female, as in the sheep, and in a few cases both sexes are hornless. No family is more difficult to subdivide, for the various forms integrate inextricably. Our mountain goat, or mazama, which dwells on the snowy heights of the Pacific coast ranges from southern British Columbia to farthest Alaska, is one of these intermediate ones, suggesting both goat and antelope in its makeup. It is about the size of an ordinary domestic goat, has small, sharp, black horns, and is clothed in long white hair with an undercoat of wool fitting it for the wintry cold in which its life is spent, for except in midwinter it never comes below timberline, and even then avoids the wooded places. In the rough mountains of Japan lives a similar goat antelope, woolly but not white, and the lofty heights of western China is the home of a smaller one, the goral, and the Himalayas have the big sero. All these have short, sharp horns rising from the top of the skull. Their nearest western neighbour is the famous chamois of the Alps and Carpathians of Europe. The extraordinary agility of these mountaineers is possible because of the pads beneath their hoofs that give them the clinging sure-footedness which is so remarkable. Most closely allied to them, probably, are the goats, also denizens of mountain regions, the typical species being confined to the highlands between the Caucasus and northwestern India. This is the true goat from which the domestic goat is descended, but the long-haired Angora goat is derived from the Makor, a sheep-like animal of the Himalayas with tall, much twisted horns. One of the special characteristics of the goats, genus Capra, is the beard of the rams, and this feature belongs also to the ibexes, several similar species of which are found from the Pyrenees eastward along the mountain tops to northern China, each occupying a limited section of country, and one inhabiting the mountains about the head of the Red Sea. That of Spain is called Boquetin, and that of the Alps Steinbock. All the rams possess great horns, sometimes 50 inches long, that rise from the occiput, curve backward, and show on their fronts a series of prominent cross ridges. One passes from these goats to their near relatives, the sheep, by way of the barrel, or burrel, which combines the characteristics of the two sections so thoroughly that the proverbial separating the sheep from the goats, easy enough on the farm, is practically impossible among wild flocks. In this crag-loving wanderer the horns of the rams are as long as those of an ibex, but roundish and wide-spreading, instead of upright and cross-ridged. The aoudad, whose home is in the mountains of Morocco and Algiers, and which is familiar in menageries, has such horns, but approaches nearer in other respects to the typical sheep, whose rams carry the great spiral horns at the side of the head that are still the pride of our domestic merinos, and were the badge of the Theban god of gods, Ra-Ammon. No better example of these magnificent mountaineers, which under one or another of several specific and local names, such as Argali, Uriel, etc., are, or were, to be found on rough highlands all the way from the Mediterranean to Bering Sea, can be shown than our own bighorn sheep of the Rocky Mountains, and the mountains of Canada and Alaska. Now we come to the great and beautiful section of the antelopes, in which naturalists recognize 35 genera and perhaps 100 species. Antelopes were scattered in Pleistocene days all over continental Europe and Asia, but never were present in America, for our so-called antelope is a pronghorn, as has been explained. 2 or 3 species now inhabit the plains of Central Asia, among them the swiftest mammal known, the Mongolian orongo, the ungainly nilgai, and the little black buck are familiar in India, and the pretty Dorcas gazelle races across the sands of Syria and Arabia, but the vast majority of antelopes belong to Africa. They range in size from the duiker-box, not much bigger than fox terriers, to the eland, which is almost the bulk of an ox, and should be domesticated, like beef cattle, for its excellent flesh. No handsomer mammals than antelopes exist, judged by either form or colouring. They inhabit all sorts of country, too, as in other lands do the deer, of which Africa has none. Deserts, such as the Sahara and the Kalahari, and the stony steeps of Somaliland, support not only the swift and agile gazelles, but several large kinds. The grassy plains of South Africa were formerly, and to some extent still are, the pastures of great herds of such antelopes, large and small, as blesboks, wildebeests, or gnus, hartebeests, steinbocks, springboks, and many others. Springboks used to assemble at certain seasons and migrate across the veldt in countless thousands, allowing nothing to stop the headlong rush of the host. The thick jungle is the refuge of the harassed antelopes, and of several diminutive kinds rarely seen in the open, and along the watercourses and in marshes live the big red waterbucks, the shy sitatungas, whose feet are curiously modified to fit them to walk on boggy ground, while rocky hills are the chosen home of the klipspringers and duikerboks, agile pygmies that creep about among the brush like big rabbits, or leap from rock to rock like miniature goats. A score or more of the species of these beautiful creatures have been carelessly or wantonly exterminated, and many others have become rare, but protective laws are now in force in all the parts of Africa controlled by the government of South Africa or organised as British, French, or Belgian dependencies. The quaint and complex musk ox, a lone relic of a past era now exiled to the remotest north, is a connecting link between the sheep and the cattle, the last and best of the ruminants. Here, as elsewhere, the style of the horns is characteristic of the group, slender, backward, curved or twisted, and somewhat compressed or keeled. In most antelopes, heavy, cross-ridged, triangular in section, and often spiral in the sheep and goats, rough and helmet-like in the musk ox, and some buffaloes, and in the oxen round, smooth, and always springing from the side of the skull. The cattle fall into three groups: buffaloes, bisons, and oxen. The buffaloes are tropical cattle, usually heavily built with massive, flattened, wrinkled horns, and the hair so thin that in old animals the bluish-black skin is left almost naked. The typical buffalo is that native to India and Ceylon, where it formerly roved in herds, which, quickly forming into a compact bunch, heads and horns out, defied attack from even the lion or tiger. Bulls often exceeded 5 feet in height, are extremely strong and quick, and carry rough horns, sweeping back circularly, which may measure 12 feet around the curve. Such a veteran herdmaster spends his days wallowing in marshy jungles, his broad, splayed hoofs sustaining him in the muddy soil, and his hairless back, coated with clay, proof against insects. But evenings and mornings he leads his band out to feed in lush prairies where the grass is tall enough to hide them. This is the race that has supplied the working cattle of hot, swampy regions, especially where rice is grown, and that has been the farmer's servant in the Far East, in Egypt, and in parts of Spain and Italy from the immemorial. Several breeds have been developed, of which the best known to Americans is the carabao of the Philippines. Africa has native buffaloes in 2 species, neither of which has been domesticated. The African buffalo is regarded as perhaps the most dangerous brute a sportsman can meet in that land of irritable beasts. Only rarely will even the lion attack one single-handed, and then seldom succeeds. The bisons, although regarded by systemists as of 2 species, the North American buffalo and the European wisent, are as nearly alike as well can be. The latter originally ranged over all Europe, and was necessarily a forest animal, and hence never could assemble into herds as did its American cousins. It has been protected on the Tsars and other great estates in Lithuania and Russia, to the number of about 700, but these preserves were ravaged during and after the World War. The wanton waste that swept away the millions of our American bison in a few short years would long ago have exterminated the species also had it not been preserved in bands here and there in the West and in various animal collections. The peculiarity of the bison is the massive, hump-like strength of the forequarters, the great mop of hair upon them and about the head, and the short, stout horns growing straight out of the side of the head. The animal called bison by sportsmen in India is the gaur, one of 4 species of true oxen inhabiting southeastern Asia, heavy animals with massive, upcurved horns, a long, ridge-like spine, short tail, and fine, glossy, dark-coloured hair. A big bull of the gaur, or slading, as Malays call it, will stand 6 feet tall at the shoulders, and is one of the greatest game animals of the world in every sense of the word. Celebes has a curious dwarf ox, the anoa, which is hardly bigger than a goat. Contrasted with this is the great ungainly yak of Tibet and the high Himalayas, where it still wanders in a wild state, although large herds are kept by the Tibetans as beasts of burden in a region where hardly any other large grazer can exist. Finally, the Orient is the home of an extraordinary race of ancient domestic animals, the white, humped cattle of India, of which many breeds exist, modified by local conditions and purposes, and prehistorically used in Egypt and probably southward. No wild animals of its kind exist. We know nothing of the origin of the race. We now come to the most interesting species of the family, now extinct as a wild animal, but perfectly traceable, the primitive wild ox of Europe, the original of our farm cattle. It was much larger than any modern breed, and bore immense, wide-spreading horns, as still do certain coarse breeds in southern Europe, and especially in Spain, where the herds of long-horned cattle of America were derived. Old bulls were black, but there is a reason to suspect that the cows and calves may have been red. This great animal roamed throughout Europe and Western Asia, and was counted among the fiercest of game in Caesar's time, who found it called or aurochs. The former word was Latinized as urus, and the latter, when this ox had disappeared, became transferred to the bison. Even in Roman times the wild ox was growing scarce, and it died out early in the 17th century. Meanwhile, from prehistoric days, calves have been tamed by the peasantry, and such cattle as Europe and the Mediterranean basin generally possessed were until quite recently little better than rough descendants of this captured stock. The so-called wild white cattle preserved in various British parks are, according to Lydekker, albino descendants of the tamed native black aurochs stock of unknown antiquity, and are kept white, with blackish or reddish ears and muzzles, by weeding out the dark-coloured calves which occasionally appear, but do not represent the original aurochs as well as do the Welsh breed preserved in Pembroke since prehistoric days. These park cattle are all of moderate size, elegantly shaped, with soft hair, white, black-tipped horns of moderate length, and many wild traits. End of section 41, read by Inkell.
Section 42 of Zoology, the Science of Animal Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Zoology, the Science of Animal Life, by Ernest Ingersoll. Beasts of Prey, the Carnivora, Part 1. Chapter 33. Beasts of Prey, the Carnivora. One of the most striking and significant results of the study of the later Mesozoic and earliest tertiary mammalian faunas, remarks Professor W.B. Scott, is that the higher, or placental, mammals are seen to be converging back to a common ancestral group of clawed and carnivorous or omnivorous animals, now entirely extinct, to which the name of creodonta was given by Cope. The creodonts are assuredly the ancestors of the modern flesh-eaters, and very probably of the great series of hoofed animals also, as well as of other orders. From this central ancestral group, the other orders proceed, diverging more and more with the progress of time, each larger branch dividing and subdividing into smaller and smaller branches until the modern condition is attained. The story of the creodonts, savage marauders large and small, includes the rise of the powerful order Carnivora, the beasts of prey, whose food is the flesh of other animals. There has always been, and always will be, in every department and rank of animal life, some or many species that live by preying on their neighbors. And every living thing, from monad to man, has to fear such enemies. The essential characteristic of the carnivores is the dentition, which is adapted to seizing, holding, biting, and cutting. The canines, rarely prominent in other groups, here become of prime importance, a dagger and hook in one, a tearing instrument. Naturally, this tooth is most developed in the dogs and the bears, which have little other means of seizing and holding an animal, whereas the cat has efficient aid in its claws. The cheek teeth in this order are typically not flat grinders, but angular and knife-edged, especially the foremost molars that shut past one another like scissor blades. And it's evident that such teeth are necessary to animals that must cut their food into pieces small enough to swallow, and are not concerned about chewing it. The order contains two distinct divisions, namely marine carnivores, seals, sea lions, walruses; land carnivores, cats, dogs, weasels, bears, etc. The marine carnivores, suborder Pinnipedia, fin-footed, have their whole organization adapted to an aquatic life and appear to have acquired it almost from the beginning of the diverse specialization that sprang from the generalized creodonts, for nothing is known of their ancestry that connects them with the known lineage of their kin on land. The body approaches a fish-like form, and the four limbs are turned into more or less perfect paddles or flippers. The teeth are of the carnivorous type. The eyes are always large and prominent, and external ears are lacking except in one family. The least modified of the three families of marine carnivora is that of the eared seals, the sea lions and fur seals of the North Pacific Ocean and southward to Cape Horn. They have kept much independence of action in the hind limbs and are able to climb readily about the rocks of the islands and shores to which they resort in midsummer for the birth of the young. They have an obvious neck, small external ears, nostrils at the tip of the snout, and, in general, more characteristics like those of land carnivores, especially the bears, than have any other pinnipeds. They live wholly on fish. Several species, termed sea lions, were formerly numerous from Oregon southward to Patagonia, and on certain South Sea islands, but they have been all but exterminated except in California. These southern species, dwelling in warmer latitudes, are known as hair seals because their coat lacks the warm undercoat of the northern species, Oteria ursina, which is the fur seal of commerce, and which would long ago have disappeared had it not been placed under international protection in its breeding places on islands in the Bering Sea. Thither, as summer opens the ice, gather the herds that have been wandering in the ocean during the winter. The females are much the more numerous of the two sexes, and having spread all over the islands, formerly in hundreds of thousands, are collected into harems. The bulls are 3 times the size of any of the females, and there are incessant combats between rival bulls. The young born here are strong enough to swim away with their mothers in the early autumn. Similar in general organization and in the freedom and usefulness of the hinder limbs for creeping on land or ice are the walruses, Trichecidae, of which there are 2 Arctic species, one in the North Atlantic and one in the seas of Alaska and Kamchatka. In old times, they came as far south in winter as Nova Scotia and the coasts of Britain. A full-grown male walrus is a very bulky animal, 10 to 12 feet long, and his skin is covered with a short coat of hair that in old age almost disappears, while his bulldog-like muzzle bristles with quill-like whiskers. The especial feature of the walrus, however, is the pair of great ivory tusks, often 2 feet or more long, which are the canines of the upper jaw. They are the tools with which the animal digs from the mud of the bottom the clams and other shellfish on which it feeds, and are formidable weapons, enabling it to protect itself and its family and mates, for which the walrus shows remarkable affection and loyalty, from the attacks of the polar bear, the only enemy besides man that it has to fear. The true seals, Phocidae, have become still further specialized toward a completely aquatic life. Their hind limbs are extended straight behind the body and take no part in progression, the four flippers alone enabling them to swim and dive with ease and speed. Their strong, claw-like nails enable them to climb onto ice floes or the shore, to which they resort for rest and sunshine, and to bear their young. These are usually only one, or at most two, at birth, and in some species they have to be carefully taught how to swim, fearing the water. All of the many kinds of seals of this family are confined to the northern hemisphere and mostly to the Arctic region. But the great sea elephant, now almost extinct, lived in the Antarctic with one colony on the southern coast of California. Most seals are gregarious, and some congregate in immense herds on ice floes far from land, but the majority of species stay near shore. Seals feed chiefly on fish, of which they consume enormous quantities. Some, however, subsist largely on crustaceans, especially prawns that swarm in the northern seas, also on mollusks, echinoderms, and even occasionally on seabirds. We are now ready to turn to the land carnivores, which, by the larger opportunity, better food, and varied conditions the land affords, have advanced far beyond their marine cousins. In these more favorable circumstances, and by their struggle for a living against the powers of defense or escape of their intended prey, and the competition of one another, they have become widely diversified in organization and habit, and in some of their representatives have developed the highest intellectual and physical ability in the animal kingdom. Bears, dogs, wolves, foxes, and jackals. The bears, Ursidae, stand lowest in the scale of rank among the carnivora because they retain, more than the others, archaic characteristics in their anatomy. The family is singularly uniform. That is, all bears are much alike in their heavy bodies, broad heads, powerful limbs with plantigrade feet, resting the whole sole on the ground, whereas most other quadrupeds are digitigrade, i.e., standing on their toes, and an extremely short tail, almost invisible in the coat of long hair that clothes their bodies. Distinction into species has been found difficult. An English naturalist once exclaimed that he knew but two in the whole world, the polar bear for one, and all the rest for the other. At the other extreme, the American systemist Dr. C. Hart Merriam announced in 1918 that the American brown and grizzly bears alone were divisible into 88 species and subspecies, based on variations in their skulls. For ordinary readers, all the big brown bears of Japan, Asia, Europe, and Canada, inclusive of the grizzlies, of which few now remain, may be regarded as one species. The polar bear, with its elongated head and body and pure white fur, as another. The small gray glacier bear of the St. Elias Alps in Alaska as another. The blue one of Tibet, the shaggy, long-lipped sloth bear of India, and the miniature sun bear of Borneo as three more. And finally, the common yellowish-nosed American black bears, the Andean spectacled bear, and the very similar black bears of the Himalayas as together constituting a seventh species. All these are as alike in habits, allowing for different surroundings and food supply, as in appearance. Eating everything from nuts, berries, and insects to fish, ground squirrels, and big game, their dentition comprises not only powerful canines, but molars capable of smashing bones. Bears are too slow and clumsy, however, to do much as big game hunters, save perhaps the polar giant in seizing seals. And it is therefore necessity rather than choice that reduces these really formidable beasts to the petty business of nibbling berry bushes, digging up bulbs or the nests of wasps and gophers, and tearing rotten logs to pieces in hopes of finding ants and beetle grubs. The most inveterate insect hunter of the tribe is the Indian sloth, or honey bear. Sir Samuel Baker remarks that its favorite delicacy is termites, for which it will scratch a large hole in the hardest soil to the depth of 2 or 3 feet. The claws of the forepaws are 3 or 4 inches in length and are useful implements for digging. It's astonishing to see the result upon soil that would require a pickaxe to excavate a hole. Having reached the large combs at the bottom of the cavity, the bear blows the dust away with a strong puff, then draws the honey and larva out of the comb into its mouth by sucking in its breath. Nevertheless, bears eat a good many young and small animals, and in the neighborhood of farms steal many calves, colts, and pigs. It is an animal to be feared by men when met, although as a rule bears are inclined to run away rather than resist, except when a she-bear feels that her young are in danger. Bears are rather solitary, the males wandering about alone, the females accompanied by cubs often as big as themselves. The young, too, as a rule, are born in midwinter in the family den, which may be a rocky cave or the hollow of an old tree, the center of a dense thicket, or simply a bed beneath the snow. The cubs at birth are surprisingly small, not larger than rabbits, and are naked, blind, and very slow to develop. Hence, the mother is extremely solicitous about them, and heedlessly brave in their defense. Bears hibernate only in the coldest regions. Allied to the bears is the large black and white coon bear, Ailuropus, a rare, vegetable-feeding brute of eastern Tibet, which is a relic of the Pleistocene. Near it in structure is the queer Ailurus of the same region, which connects the bears with our raccoons and those other little brothers of the bear, the Kingfishers and coatis of the American tropics. End of section 42. Section 43 of Zoology, the Science of Animal Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Zoology, the Science of Animal Life by Ernest Ingersoll. Beasts of Prey, the Carnivora, Part 2. The Dog Family, Wolves, Foxes, and Jackals. Some of my readers may have asked themselves how the order of the families or other groups of mammals is determined, why the edentates follow the marsupials, the rodentia come next, and so on. The reason is that their ancestors, so far as we know them as fossils, seem to have been related in a way that indicates such a succession of development in time. It is scarcely more than an indication, however, for although in describing them or making a list, we must set the animals in a row, naturalists long ago ceased attempting to show that any linear arrangement of that kind represented the reality. The present variety among mammals, as in other classes, is the result of development along different lines from one or more points of beginning. Throughout a long period in the early part of the Tertiary era, there prevailed a class of beasts of prey, some as big as tigers, which, however, were by no means carnivora as we now know them, for their teeth, in most cases, were still of the insectivore type. These were the creodonts of which I spoke a few pages back. They combined in their structure the features of all the different families of carnivora, and it was not until there had developed from their stock a single family, Myacidae, and the rest had died out, that the canine or carnassial teeth became prominent in their jaws, and nature found in this the right road to progress. To this anciently extinct family we may trace all the varieties of existing carnivora. The oldest and most central stock appears to be that of the dog family, Canidae. The least of these are the jackals of Africa and Asia, small, active, noisy, reddish, and variously marked animals like miniature wolves, which dwell in deserts and open districts, where they hide in dens during the day and come out at night in search of mice and anything else they can get. They haunt the suburbs of towns and do great service as scavengers, but also raid farms and villages, killing great numbers of poultry, lambs, and weakly sheep and goats by methods much like those of our American coyotes. The coyote is a true wolf, and the wolves are connected with the jackals by a small intermediate species in India. Formerly, the coyote ranged eastwardly throughout the prairie east of the Mississippi, but farmers gradually killed it off. On the sparsely settled plains, however, it survives from the Arctic Circle to the tropics in several species, and continues to maintain itself because its natural enemies have been killed off, and because it is extremely clever in dodging new perils. It is far more destructive to the ranchman's chickens, pigs, and lambs than even the big timber wolf, but, on the other hand, benefits the industry by aiding him in exterminating troublesome gophers, prairie dogs, and rabbits. The big gray wolf, the wolf par excellence, which our Western men usually call timber wolf to distinguish it from the coyote, the wolf of the plains, is the most widely distributed of all beasts of prey, for despite the various names given it, this fierce and capable animal is to be found throughout the northern zones of the globe, from Kamchatka, Japan, and northern India right around to Alaska. Where civilization prevails, it has been killed off, yet lingers where mountains give it hiding places even in the oldest settled parts of Europe. In North America, wolves abound in all the wilder parts of the West and North, contesting with skill and courage the effort of advancing civilization to get rid of them. This wolf, in its largest examples, such as the often pure white specimens of the Arctic coasts and islands, where it travels as far north as do the caribou and other game, may measure 3.5 feet in length, exclusive of the bushy tail, and may weigh 150 pounds. Its color is typically rusty or yellowish gray above, more or less grizzled, while the underparts are whitish, and the tail is often tipped with black. These hues are paler in northern than in southern specimens, and in warm regions, totally black races are known, one of which exists in Florida. The wolf's mode of life is virtually that of the whole canine family, making allowances for differences in climate and circumstances. Choosing a convenient little cave among the rocks of a mountainside, or, when this is not handy, digging a burrow for themselves, a pair will establish a den in early summer, where presently 6 or 8 whelps may be born, but usually only 2 or 3 survive babyhood. At this season, small game is abundant, and the animals wandering around alone by day as well as by night pick up a good living, grow fat and lazy, and are little to be feared save by the mothers of fawns or lambs. As the onset of winter fills the forest with snow, cold gales moan through the trees, and the long, dark nights enshroud an almost dead world, this peaceable disposition changes into a hungry ferocity and a force of craft and caution born of the direst need, which at last make the animal formidable to man himself. Yet actual attacks on men are much more rare than stories and traditions would lead one to think. It is at this season, when the rabbits and other small creatures are gone or hidden in hibernation, and large game must be depended on for food, that the wolves form themselves into small companies or packs and assist one another. To this class of animals, hunting is truly the chase, for their method is, having found their quarry, in which the good nose for a trail and a keen hearing assist them, to keep it in sight and run it down. Having overtaken the quarry, a sideways leap enables them to thrust in the long canine and drag on it, and the result is death unless the hunted creature is able to turn and fight off its foe with hooves and horn. The forests of southern Brazil harbor a long-legged, reddish species called the maned, which is a true wolf, and South America generally has several kinds of fox dogs, genus Lycalopex, that sufficiently make up for the absence of true wolves, as do jackals, the lack of wolves in Africa and Arabia. Foxes have long been regarded as constituting a separate genus under their Latin name Vulpes, but conservative naturalists now think they belong with the wolves in the genus Canis, a dog. The type is that of a smaller, more agile and delicate animal than a wolf or jackal, with a broader skull and sharper muzzle, larger ears, a longer, more bushy tail, and usually longer fur. Weaker than its wolfish relatives, though endowed with great swiftness and used to playing the double role of hunter and hunted, its brain has been developed to a high degree to make up for its bodily deficiencies, and shows capacity for further development. Nevertheless, the fox is not quite such a marvel of shrewdness as he is reputed to be, and fox hunters in Great Britain, under whose combination of care and chase his education has been more advanced than anywhere else, note much diversity in brain work among them. Although the North American red fox has a different name from the typical European one, it is virtually the same, and shows its skill and adaptability by continuing to live and flourish in the midst of our civilization, where it practices quite as much sly craft and success in chicken stealing as does Reynard on the other side of the ocean. The red fox is to be found all over the continent as far south as Georgia, and where the winters are cold, his long and silky fur becomes of marketable value, especially in its darker varieties. The animal has touches of black on the tail and the legs, and this seems liable to affect the whole pelage in the north. Thus, some are all black, others are black with every hair tipped with white, and are called silvers. Others have a blackish band along the spine and across the shoulders. To these the name cross foxes is given. The skins so marked bring high prices, and an extensive industry has arisen in Canada by breeding black and marked foxes in captivity, where pure color strains have been developed, whereas in nature one or more of these melanistic varieties may occur in any litter of normally red parents. North America has 3 or more other species of fox, one of which, the gray fox, is common throughout the country east and south of the Appalachian Heights, as far north as the lower valley of the Hudson River. It is smaller and grayer than the red fox, is more of a forest-keeping animal, and does not burrow, but makes its nest in the bottom of a decayed tree or stump, or within a hollow log. Living in a climate where small game is abundant the year round, and chicken stealing comparatively easy, He's not been driven to the straits of getting food in winter to which the northern foxes are driven, and hence has developed less of the ingenuity and cleverness they show. On the high plains of the west dwells a small, active fox known as the kit fox or swift, which feeds on the ground squirrels and mice of that region, and makes its home in a burrow, often one dug by a prairie dog, where it hibernates in winter. It is now rare and very wary. Throughout the polar regions right around the globe is found the Arctic fox in great numbers, and wandering in summer at least to the farthest islands where its prey consists of lemmings, rabbits, ptarmigan, and fish. This is a shy little beast with blunt nose, short, rounded ears, a very long bushy tail, and the soles of the feet well shod with hair, giving them a firm and warm grip on the snow and ice, over which they leave tiny tracks from Labrador to Siberia. In summer, its dress is brown with whitish or drab underparts. But in autumn, this is replaced by a coat of long, pure white hair, beneath which is an undercoat of fine wool. A small proportion, however, are never either white or dark brown, but are slate gray all the year round. In some rather southerly places, the blues prevail, forming a local race. Such is the case in Greenland, Iceland, and the Aleutian Islands, where blue foxes are now carefully preserved and cared for in a semi-domestic condition for the sake of their valuable fur. Several small kinds of foxes occur in Asia, and in India one affords some sport with hounds. The prettiest of all are the little sand-colored, big-eared fennecs of the deserts of northern Africa and Arabia. No foxes tame well, nor do any of them cross with dogs as wolves and jackals constantly do, and apparently no fox blood has entered into the composition of the domestic dog. There remain in this ancient and cosmopolitan family a considerable number of animals which, from their general appearance, we call dogs. Among these is the long-bodied, short-legged, primitive bush dog of Guyana, the Baikor of South Africa, several oriental species, and the hated hunting dog of Africa. The last named is a terror even to a lion. It ranges the country in swift-footed packs, dreaded by every creature of both forest and veldt, and every rider increases its reputation for both strategy and ferocity. This has led to its being killed off, until now it is common only in the remote wilderness. Formerly it was known even in Egypt, and it is the party-colored, prick-eared dog represented on the ancient mural paintings at Beni Hassan and elsewhere. Of the Asiatic wild dogs, the most familiar is that one of India called, in the north, Buanchua, and in the south, Dholi. Like the others, it is normally rusty red in color and makes its lair in rocky jungles, whence, more often by day than by night, it makes its forays, usually in packs, from which even the leopard and tiger flee, just as in this country half a dozen curs will send a cougar or jaguar up a tree in fright. But it avoids settlements and does little damage to domestic animals. This brings us to the consideration of the origin of our domestic dogs, a matter which seems to me more simple than some authors have regarded it. This was doubtless among the very first animals to become attached to the camp or family of primitive man, and in every case, at first, at least, it would be of some local species of wolf, for anatomists agree that no admixture of any blood outside the genus Canis is traceable in the dog, and probably would be cherished or tolerated as a reserve supply of food rather than as an aid in hunting. But it's not unreasonable to suppose that when famine came and the stone axe was raised against the poor animals, those that had proved good watchers, or were the special pets of the women and children, would be the last to be sacrificed, and sometimes would be saved altogether. Thus, an improving and alterative selection would have begun almost from the start. Moreover, these early camp dogs would become modified by interbreeding and by the influences of captivity, and, as their vagabondish owners wandered about, would be crossed not only with diverse sorts of tame dogs, but with the wild stocks of new countries. And this complication would increase as civilization extended. Nevertheless, this appears not quite to complete the story. There is a quality which we recognize as doggy, and as something distinctive. Whence came it? I am of the opinion that it is derived from one or more kinds of canine animals exterminated by primitive man, which were more doggy than wolfish, and which formed in large part the stock of the first domesticated dogs. This supposition is supported by the fact that there have been found remains of a distinct canine species, allied to the Australian dingo, which was domesticated by Neolithic men, and perhaps contributed to the existing varieties of the dog. The earliest Egyptian monuments show pictures of large dogs with lop ears, denoting one of the most striking differences between dogs and wild wolves or jackals, whose ears are invariably pricked. End of section 43. Section 44 of Zoology, the Science of Animal Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Zoology, the Science of Animal Life by Ernest Ingersoll. Beasts of Prey, the Carnivora, Part 3. The Source of Costly Furs. A descendant of the Creodonta, called Cynodictis, which lived in the Eocene, or earliest of the Tertiary periods, is regarded as the forefather of the dog family, but its character is such that it might as well be said to be the progenitor of the weasel family, Mustelidae, which may thus be suitably considered the nearest relatives of the Canidae. These are the small but alert, muscular, and wide-awake animals whose coats, adapted to the cold regions in which most of them live, furnish us with warm and beautiful furs. Hence, the Mustelidae may be called the family of fur-bearers. They resemble the dog tribe in the breadth of the skull and in the dentition, which serves well for the wide variety in their fare. But instead of the long, high-stepping legs of the galloping dogs, they have short, strong limbs, adapted to creeping, digging, climbing, or swimming. The swimmers are otters, one marine, the other a denizen of rivers and lakes. The sea otter is peculiar to our northwestern coast, where it used to be very abundant from California to Bering Sea, but is now so rare on account of the great demand for its unequaled fur that its pelt is worth several $100s to the fortunate hunter. It is truly pelagic, rarely landing anywhere but on some outer reef or isolated rock, and eating fish, sea urchins, and crabs, and is much larger than the land otter, and with a short, flattened tail instead of the long, tapering one that characterizes the latter. Of the river otters, about 10 species are recognized, scattered all over the cooler parts of the world, and much alike in their four-webbed feet and fish-eating habits. They are lively, playful creatures, and by their wariness, nocturnal habits, and skill in hiding their burrows, made in the bank with an underwater entrance, They are able to persist here and there in the midst of civilization. Allied to the otters in structure are the badgers and skunks. Of the former, our badger has been killed off everywhere except in the Northwest, where it still digs its deep holes in the ground for its daylight rest and partial hibernation, and finds plentiful food among the gophers, doing the ranchman more good by destroying these pests than it does harm by its digging. The European badger differs in various ways, and there is an Oriental one, the stinking teledoo, which illustrates the fetid odor that belongs to all of this family. This disagreeable quality is developed in the skunks into an effective weapon of defense. The food of skunks consists mainly of insects and field mice, and is everywhere so abundant that they find civilization favorable to them rather than otherwise, and remain numerous all over the country in several species, of which the familiar large northern skunk and the small southern striped one are best known. The skunks are confined to America, but South Africa has a very similar creature in the zorilla. We now come to a large number of vigorous, bloodthirsty, and cunning little carnivores, the terror of small game, as are the cats of larger animals, which are grouped by their similarity of structure in the weasel section of the family Mustelinae. Some are mainly terrestrial, others arboreal in habit of life. All have rather long bodies, short legs armed with strong, sharp claws, pointed heads, cat-like teeth, and brains equal, if not superior, to any other carnivore. Among the terrestrial species, the glutton of Europe and its analog in Canada, the wolverine, are prominent. The wolverine is a large, shaggy, somewhat clumsy animal that seeks its prey mainly on the ground, but occasionally climbs to a low branch or an overhanging rock, whence it may leap upon the backs of a deer or sheep. It displays the greatest sagacity and persistence in getting a living where life is precarious, and is so clever in robbing the trapper's lures and penetrating his caches that the forest people consider it hardly anything else than a devil on four legs, and charge it with deliberate malice. The voracity of its European cousin long ago became the subject of ridiculous traditions, and has given the word glutton to the language. Two similar but smaller mustelines, the tyra and the grison, inhabit Central and South America. The latter defends itself in the same manner as the skunk. The weasels, stoats, polecats, minks, and the like form a group distinctly northern, except that one species ranges southward into the Andes. They do their work on the ground, although some are able to climb trees. Slender, lithe, sharp-clawed, secretively colored, and endowed with strength, speed, and cleverness, the weasels are the scourge and terror of the ground-keeping animals, and do more than any other class of agents to restrain mice, gophers, and similar nuisances. Europe and Siberia have the stoat, the ermine weasel, and the polecat, a domestic form of which is the ferret. And we have in North America several distinct weasels, as the short-tailed and the long-tailed of the East, the bridled weasel of the Pacific coast, the black-footed ferret of the plains, and the little 6-inch mouse hunter of the Northwest, which is the smallest carnivore known. All the northern weasels become pure white in winter, when they live in a region where the snow lies continuously and the cold is steady. But south of that line, they do not change color. The change from the summer brown to the winter white, when they become ermines, is produced by an actual loss of color in the hair, but the spring change back to brown is effected by shedding the old white hair and getting a new brown coat. In the Middle Ages, ermine fur was permitted to be worn only by royalty and later by judges on the bench. A somewhat different and strictly American species is the mink. It is somewhat less slender than the weasels and is semi-aquatic in habits, dwelling always near streams, where it feeds on earthworms, frogs, and fishes. Having this kind of food and being keen-witted and secretive, it has been able to continue to exist in the midst of civilization, and the vast number of its dark pelts that come to the fur market are nearly all got by farmers' boys in traps set near home. The most valuable of the fur-bearers, however, are those that belong to the forests of the north and dwell in trees, the sables, martens, and pekins. The sable is Siberian, the marten is North European, and the pine marten and pekin are North American. The first three are hardly distinguishable, each averaging about 18 inches in length, exclusive of the long furry tail, and are brown, somewhat lighter on the underparts, the breast spot of the Canadian species being orange. The body is long and supple, the legs short and the toes separate, with sharp, long claws, as becomes so expert a tree climber. The martens exhibit great agility and grace in their movements, and live usually in trees, furnishing with a bed of leaves a hollow in a lofty, decaying trunk, or sometimes in a rocky crevice. Here the young are brought forth in litters of 6 or 8, early each spring. In winter, however, they descend daily and hunt rabbits and other prey over the snow. This is particularly true of the big Canadian pekin or fisher marten, which is the least common of the tribe. These martens fade away as civilization advances toward their forest retreats, and are now to be obtained only in the wildest parts of the Canadian woods, and the effort to tame and breed them in captivity has met with little success. Civets, mongooses, and hyenas. This group of Old World animals represents the product of lines of descent that had their origin very near that of the dogs, as is particularly evident in the history of the hyenas, family Hyenidae. But between the noble courage and fidelity of the dog and the cowardly brutishness of the hyena lies a great distance in character, as it appears from the human point of view. Of course, it will not do to apply our highly elaborated standards to a moral estimate of wild animal behavior, or to use seriously such terms as cruel, selfish, and the like, especially in the case of the predatory beasts that work hard for their captures, must kill them the best way they can, and must satisfy their own wants before yielding place to rivals or inferiors. Yet we cannot help admiring certain qualities in some of them and disliking others, as if they were inspired by praiseworthy or blameworthy motives. In the character of the hyenas, thus criticized, there is nothing admirable except their extraordinary brute strength. This is shown chiefly in their big heads, where their jaws are filled with teeth of extraordinary size, and are worked by muscles that enable them to crunch the leg bones of an ox, or indent and bend thick iron, of which amazing examples are given by Selous, Newman, and other African sportsmen. Otherwise, they are the meanest of brutes, hated and despised by every man and beast in the countries, Africa and southern Asia, that they afflict. Related to them, but very different in every way, are the many species of ichneumons and civets, family Viveridae, of the same parts of the world. The ichneumons, or mongooses, are small, dark-colored, unspotted animals, varying in size from that of a weasel to the bigness of a house cat, with compact bodies and pointed muzzles. They are active, bold, and predacious, living on small game of every sort and making their homes in holes in the ground. They are noted for their animosity to reptiles, and in ancient Egypt were protected as sacred because they killed asps and hunted for and ate crocodiles' eggs. The old term ichneumon has disappeared, however, in favor of the term mongoose, which is the name of the East Indian species famous for snake killing. It is able, by its astonishing quickness, to spring upon and kill a cobra, even when that deadly snake is prepared to strike at its little foe. Mongooses were colonized in Jamaica and other West Indian islands years ago to destroy the rats that were a plague in the sugar plantations, but they presently turned their attention to the poultry as easier game, and became a greater nuisance than the rats. These fierce little snake killers constitute the Herpestine section of the family. The viverrin section contains the civets, which have elongated bodies, terrier-like heads, small, rounded, five-toed feet with imperfectly sheathed claws, long, often bushy tails, and coats of rough, dark-colored hair marked with blackish stripes, bars, or squarish blotches. The species are numerous and varied. Those of Central Africa, called genets, resembling weasels. They include the linsangs of the East Indies, with soft fawn-colored fur, several East Indian species inhabiting trees and going by the name of tree cats and toddy cats, one of which is domesticated as a mouser and pretty pet by the natives, and the black binturong of the Orient, which is the only animal of the Old World, not a marsupial, that has a prehensile tail. The distinctive peculiarity of the true civet cat is the possession of a pair of open pouches in the groin, holding an oily substance having an intense musky odor and known as civet. This is present in the 5 oriental species, but is most copious in the civet cat of northern Africa, which on this account is kept captive and occasionally relieved, by the aid of a small spoon, of its civet, for which perfumers will pay a high price. Madagascar possesses a remarkable animal in the fossa or fasain, which is nearly the size of our puma, has a weasel-like head and a very long tail, and is a fierce nocturnal marauder. It is classed with the Viveridae, but stands intermediate between them and the cats. End of section 44. Section 45 of Zoology, the Science of Animal Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Zoology, the Science of Animal Life by Ernest Ingersoll. Beasts of Prey, continued. Chapter 34, Beasts of Prey, continued. In the cats, family Felidae, we come to the most recent and advanced development of the carnivorous type, by straight descent from the Eocene Myacidae. Their cardinal characteristics are found in their round heads and short muzzles, their teeth fitted for cutting rather than chewing, with sharp and slender canines very prominent, their sheathed claws, and their powerful activity. Although the civets and the fossa have retractile claws, they do not show the perfection exhibited in this feature in the cat family. Here, the final bone of every toe, the terminal phalange, is so hinged upon the one next behind it that ordinarily it stands upright, held there by an elastic ligament, with the sharp, curved claw hidden in a sheath of skin and thus kept from touching the ground and so becoming blunted. For in the cat's method of work, sharp claws are needed to hold the prey on which it has leaped until its teeth can come into play. When this seizing leap is made, a tendon running along the underside of the toe is retracted, pulling down the claw and causing it to pierce and hold the body of the victim. This is the explanation of Puss's familiar scratching ability, and accounts for the fact that, while dogs, developing long legs for their style of attack, chase and finally seize their prey with their big, strong canines, cats steal upon it, or more often lie in ambush and pounce on it, using their slender canines mainly as piercers. The cats do their hunting mostly alone, and are therefore largely at the mercy of wolves, etc., who go in packs, and herein lies the origin of the fear and hate with which cats regard all dogs. The cats are a very uniform group, all the many species belonging to the single genus Felis, except the few lynxes and the cheetah. No better example of the race can be found than our fireside sphinx. She is a direct descendant of the Caffra, or Libyan cat, a native of northeastern Africa, and especially of Egypt, where she still runs wild. Reddish sandy in color, with faint, broken, darker bars across the body, limbs, and tail, and narrow vertical lines on the face, excellent copies of this original of all the domestic cats of the Western world, at least, may often be seen in our houses. This likeness is supported by the evidence of history and archaeology, the skeletons of Egyptian cat mummies, and bones associated with the dawn of history. In regard to the present, however, some deduction must be made. In all parts of the world, one or another of the smaller wild cats of the country have been kept as pets in native houses, and wherever the people have been far enough advanced to raise and store grain, they have cultivated a cat or some other animal to free their granaries from thieving mice. It was for this purpose, no doubt, that the cats of Egypt were first tamed, and then, to make the people prudently keep them and care for them, the priests invented a beneficent and cheerful cat goddess, who, naturally, was said to walk abroad mostly by moonlight. When the tamed Egyptian cats reached Europe with the early Phoenician colonists and traders, they would certainly soon meet and interbreed with the native stock, and to such crossing is probably due the banded or tabby cats. On the other hand, brindled cats were formerly unknown in eastern Asia, whose spotted or foxy house cats were derived from other and local sources. Since intercourse between Europe and the Orient became frequent, more or less mixture has occurred, although one very distinct eastern breed persists, the long-furred Persian or Angora cats, a race probably derived prehistorically from the Mammal of Turkestan. The differences between members of this genus Felis, all of which seem able to interbreed when similar in size, are chiefly of size and coat. Their prey and hunting methods are substantially alike everywhere, and in domestication, cats are slow to vary from the wild type in any respect except color, a result of their mixed ancestry. Puss remains a savage in a civilized coat, and accepting condescendingly the novel comforts offered her, refuses to forsake her own forest gods for the fireside shrines of her tempters. The word wildcat is naturally used for any small feline, but strictly belongs to the yellowish, tabby-marked forest cat, F. catus, of Europe and Siberia, now becoming rare. Closely allied to it is the mannel of the Central Asian steppes, where the long fur that envelops it, as preserved in our domestic Persian beauties, is required by the awful cold of those lofty plains. Several other small cats inhabit the desert parts of southern Asia, which abound in rodents, and the long-legged, powerful, fawn-colored caracal ranges, nowhere numerously, from India and Mesopotamia around to Arabia and South Africa. Africa has several other cats of the open country, the best known of which is the swift-running, handsome serval, which is an expert tree climber. Southeastern Asia has 3 or 4 beautifully marked forest cats and 4 of great size, 3 leopards, and the tiger. The typical leopard is distributed from China and Borneo westward to southern Arabia and all over Africa, except in deserts and cold mountains. But the ounce, which may be regarded as a variety of it, inhabits the Himalayas, staying near the borders of the snow line for the most part, and another beautiful variety, the clouded leopard, frequents the forests of the median slopes of that vast range. The ground color of the leopard is yellowish-brown, of varying intensity, and is thickly covered with rosettes of black spots enclosing a clear area, with the breast and belly white. The favorite haunts of leopards are rocky, brushy hills with holes suitable for a den, where they may watch the surrounding country, and at sunset descend with astonishing celerity and stealth to cut off any straggling animal returning to the village at nightfall. They prey boldly on the small Hindu cattle and ponies, but more habitually on the sheep, goats, and dogs, and now and then, but rarely, turn man-eaters. The leopard cannot overcome, ordinarily, animals as large as the lion and tiger slay, but everything of lesser size is acceptable, down to robbing birds' nests and clawing grubs out of rotten wood. It is somewhat smaller than our cougar, a male in good condition weighing about 125 pounds. The tiger, for there is only one, in spite of circus advertisements of a royal Bengal as something different, is purely Asiatic, the species ranging from the Caucasus and the mountains of Ararat to the East Indies, Sumatra and Java, and northward to central Siberia and Sakhalin. It is to be found throughout all India, but does not occur in Ceylon. Speaking of the tiger always brings to mind that other great cat, the lion. These powerful marauders dispute the title of king of beasts. Their respective realms overlap but little. The lion, like the other big cats, is a relic of a diminishing race and kingdom. In the early Stone Age, the cave lion, virtually the same as the present Felis leo, roamed throughout the southern half of Europe, and its final extermination north of the Mediterranean was doubtless accomplished by prehistoric men. Afghanistan, Baluchistan, and northern Persia were rid of them long ago. A century ago, lions were more or less prevalent in northwestern India, but now none remain save a few in the Gir, a wooded, hilly tract of Kathiawar. In Persia, they survive only in Farsistan, where marshes afford shelter, and the hosts of pigs feeding on the acorns of the oak forests furnish subsistence. But they were long ago exterminated from all Asia Minor, Arabia, Egypt, and Algeria. From Abyssinia and the southern Sahara southward to the Orange River, lions still exist except in the most populous districts, and in some places are very numerous. This range of territory shows that, unlike the forest-loving tiger, the lion is an inhabitant of open, bushy country, finding its game in the herds of antelopes, zebras, and similar plains-running animals, rather than in the jungle fauna to which the tiger is confined. Also that the tiger is inured to a far colder climate. This difference in habitat and hunting requirements accounts, in the minds of those who pay much attention to adaptive or protective coloration, for the difference in their dress. For the tiger is said to become almost invisible in its yellow coat and vertical black stripes amid the flickering shadows of the wood, or when creeping through the long Indian grass, while the unmarked grayish-yellow or sand tint of the lion is equally unnoticeable on the desert or on the sere veldt of its East African hunting grounds. The great mane of the male lion, but some never acquire this ornament or only scantily, and his great height at the shoulder give him a majestic mien. A lion of large size measures about 9.5 feet from the nose to the tip of the tail, which is about 3 feet long, stands 3.5 feet high at the shoulders, and weighs about 500 pounds. Most specimens, however, fall far short of these figures, and the largest examples have come from South Africa. The dimensions and weight of tigers average just about the same, the extreme examples on record having no doubt been measured along the curves of the body instead of in a straight line between the two terminal points, nose and tip of tail, as is the proper method. The literature relating to these two royal and poisoned beasts is immense in its extent, and the best of it is that written by the hunter-naturalists who during the past century have studied and fought them in their native wilds. The Western Hemisphere has a series of native cats which, although not equal in size and strength to the lion and tiger, are hardly less formidable in view of the game they hunt. The biggest is the jaguar, which is found from western Texas to northern Argentina. It is about the size of the leopard, but has a bulkier body, bigger head, shorter and more massive limbs, and shorter tail. Hence, while less active and supple, it is perhaps more powerful than the leopard, and certainly is stronger than the puma. The ground color varies from the yellowish-gray seen in arid Paraguay to almost red in the steaming equatorial swamps, while in the lower Orinoco Valley, deep brown and black ones are common. But there is only one species. The coat is everywhere spotted with black, not in the leopard's hollow rosettes, but forming larger, irregular groups, each enclosing a black central spot. This is the tigre of the American tropics, and indeed is so called wherever Spanish is spoken. It hunts the largest game of its country, especially tapirs and deer, and wherever domestic animals are reared, it becomes a destructive pest. For the most part, however, these cats subsist on capybaras and other rodents, and in Mexico on peccaries, striking down stragglers and then hastening up a tree out of the way of the furious herd of these sharp-toothed pigs, brought together by the squealing of the first victim. Rarely found away from water, which seems as necessary to it as to the tiger, it's not surprising to find that in such places as the reedy borders of La Plata, fish form its main diet, snatched from the water by the paw. On the Amazon, it feeds largely on turtles and their eggs. It attacks the manatee in its own element, and has been seen dragging out of the water this bulky animal weighing as much as an ox. Even the crocodile and caiman are regularly preyed upon. Its fondness for monkeys is also well known, and it is hated and reviled by them with the same fury as leads the East Indian apes to hurl sticks and bad language at the tiger. The cougar, as Buffon named it, the puma of the Peruvians, panther and mountain lion as it is known in the United States, is another big American cat familiar to woodsmen from New England, Minnesota, and northern British Columbia, southward to Patagonia. And everywhere it is so precisely uniform that the most hair-splitting systemists have been unable to subdivide its species, Felis concolor, into local varieties. Its upper parts vary from foxy red to a dull blue, this difference in color having no reference to age, season, or locality. The underparts are white, and there are no spots anywhere except that the lips and outer rim of the ear are black, and a patch of white marks each side of the muzzle. The panther was much dreaded by the early settlers of the eastern states and by the frontiersmen settling the Mississippi Valley, who were more alarmed by its doleful screams as it wandered about in the night than by any history of harm, for it avoided men with a greater fear than their own. Nevertheless, it became a nuisance by its raids on the farmer's livestock, and he killed it off, so that now pumas are to be met with only in the forested and swampy fastness of some of the Gulf states and in the far west. There, they still do great damage to the young animals on ranches, especially where horses are plentiful on the range. This is equally true of South America. Nowhere, however, is the puma feared by mankind as is the jaguar. On the contrary, remarkable stories are recorded, and constantly being verified by experience, not only of the cowardice of the animal, but of his apparent desire to make friends with humanity, following lonely persons without harming them, apparently merely in satisfaction of an innocent curiosity. It is hunted usually with dogs, to escape which it will climb into a tree, and once there, remain to be shot rather than come down and fight, even when the hunters are close up. Tropical America is the home of several smaller cats, some of which, among the spotted ones, are probably the only varieties of the ocelot. This highly variable, but always beautiful, creature is about 2.5 feet long in body, rather long in the legs, is an expert tree climber, and is abundant from Oklahoma southward into the Brazilian forest, but has a different name in every country. It is grayish, thickly marked with fawn-colored, black-edged, oval patches and stripes in endless variety, and its fur is one of the most marketable in the country. On the prairies and plains of the open country south of Brazil, the pampas cat, or pájaro, is common. It is of robust form, with long hair, very plain in its grayish tint on the back, but beautifully spotted and striped on the belly and legs. It is a ground runner, preying on rodents and birds. Brazil has in its forests a notable cat of medium size called the jaguarandi, with a noticeably slender form, short legs, and a tail nearly as long as its body. It is dark gray in hue and entirely unspotted. This may, on further study, turn out to be only a variety of the Era, another cat of the tropics, sometimes met with as far north as the Rio Grande Valley, which looks in its unspotted chestnut coat more like a huge weasel than a cat. It is a graceful and nimble climber, and lives on prey caught in trees. Our common bobcat, the wildcat best known to most readers, is a lynx. One might say the lynx, since, in spite of the wide variety that specimens show between those of Quebec and those of Texas, for example, all seem to be one species, which is only locally different from the lynx of the Old World. But Spain appears to possess a distinct species in the Pardine lynx. Lynxes differ from the typical cats, Felis, in having only 2 instead of 3 premolar teeth, but most notably in their heavy bodies, stout limbs, big and powerful feet, very short, thick tails, and the tufts of hair on the tips of the ears. The big Canadian lynxes are clothed in coats of long, grizzled hair, valuable in the fur market and suited to the freezing winters of their home, where their fare during the cold months is restricted almost entirely to hares. But in the United States, especially toward the south. These cats are much smaller, have thin coats, and show reddish and yellowish tints with much spottings. They have survived the presence of civilization wherever rough hills or swampy forests give them a refuge, and they prey on mice, rabbits, birds, and poultry. A single cat remains to be mentioned, the curious cheetah, or hunting leopard, which is known all over southern Asia and Africa, and in India and Persia is trained to hunt antelopes. It is somewhat less in size of body than the leopard, but stands on long legs, and in color is yellowish, with many obscure blackish spots. Its great peculiarity, however, is the fact that its claws are not retractile, like those of true cats, or only partly so, and that it chases its prey with great speed and in a dog-like manner, although lacking the dog's persistence and endurance. This mingling of characteristics makes it hard to classify, and it perhaps should have led, instead of closed, the chapter on the cat family. End of section 45.
Section 46 of Zoology, the Science of Animal Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Caprice. Zoology, the Science of Animal Life by Ernest Ingersoll. Insectivora, Hedgehogs, Moles, and Shrews. Again, we have to deal with the scattered and feeble relics of a once important race. But that was long ago, even as geologists use the word long, for the order of insectivores, Insectivora, may be traced backward to the very earliest, hardly identifiable fossil remains of mammalian pioneers in a reptilian world. These are known mainly by their dentition, which in this order is characterized by weak canines, small, sharp incisors, and all the back teeth small, with many points and sharp edges designed for cutting through the shards of insects, shells of eggs, snail shells, and the like, rather than for chewing. They had become, even in the Eocene period, a numerous and varied group, including arboreal, terrestrial, and aquatic types, some of considerable size, besides many minute forms comparable to the moles and shrews of the present day, and very likely ancestral to them. At the beginning of the Tertiary, they are indistinguishable from the earlier of the creodonts, but these rapidly developed into powerful beasts, while the insectivores retained more nearly their ancient ways, and in the later Tertiary diminished rapidly in numbers and variety. Today, only a few survivors are left, protected from their enemies by armor. As in the case of the hedgehogs, by a subterranean mode of life, as the moles, by their agility, minute size, and unpleasant odor and taste, as are the shrews, or, finally, by their exile in some remote corner of the world where enemies are few. Thus we find remnants of families so widely separated as Madagascar and Cuba, the same disintegration that has overtaken many another ancient and decadent tribe, and their organization is so generalized that systemists find it difficult to place them in any serial arrangement with other orders. The big Malayan caguin, for instance, which lives in trees and looks and behaves like a flying squirrel, was long classed with the lemurs. Oldest of the existing insectivores, and nearest the original type, is the hedgehog of Europe, which, when rolled up, presents to its enemy a living chestnut fur of stiff spines hardly bigger than a baseball. All day it lies curled up asleep in an underground nest, where in winter it hibernates, and wanders about at night hunting for insects, worms, snails, slugs, and the like, and savagely attacking and killing every viper it comes across. A valuable little animal, preserved by every intelligent gardener. Next to it are the lively little tupaias, or tree shrews of the east, and the queer, long-nosed, kangaroo-shaped jumping shrews of the deserts. A rarer oddity is the river shrew of West Africa, looking and acting like a miniature muskrat. Then there are the almikis of Cuba and Haiti, which suggest small, ground-travelling opossums whose nearest relatives are the spiny tenrecs of Madagascar. More familiar to us are the moles and shrews of northern countries. Moles are chiefly remarkable for the adaptation of their frames to the requirements of an underground existence in which they must travel and seek their food, and not merely make their nightly home in burrows. This has brought about an alteration of the forelimbs into digging tools of really gigantic power when we consider the size of the animal, and a strength of shoulders that enables them to bore their way through loose soil without shoveling it out, save at long intervals. Everybody knows the upheaved ridges that mark their paths on the lawn as they move here and there beneath the grass roots in search of grubs and earthworms. One of our common species, preferring wet meadows to the uplands, is the star-nosed mole, whose muzzle is encircled by pink tentacles, very sensitive, which give it its name. Highest in rank among insectivores, though least in size, are the shrews, one of which, our Cooper's shrew, is the smallest of all mammals. They are mouse-like in appearance, but with long, flexible, much bewhiskered snouts, and are ceaselessly active, wandering about underneath leaves, old grass, and logs, and boring their way into loose loam or the punky wood of decayed stumps in search for earthworms, grubs, beetles, slugs, and similar prey, including young mice and the fledglings of ground-nesting birds, and varying this fare by bites from soft-shelled beechnuts, tuberous roots, etc. They are quick of hearing, bold, pugnacious, and fierce, often killing and eating other shrews, difficult to keep alive in captivity, utterly untamable, and easily frightened to death. End of section 46.
Section 47 of Zoology, the Science of Animal Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Zoology, the Science of Animal Life, by Ernest Ingersoll. The bats, wing-handed mammals. Next in advance of the Insectivora stands the order Chiropetra handwing, which is the tribe of bats, divisible into two suborders, the large diurnal fruit bats and the small nocturnal insect-catching bats and the vampires. No fossil remains bridging the gap between these two orders has been discovered, nor can anyone yet explain the steps in the acquirement of the bats' powers of flight. Bats are simple flying mammals, necessarily small, with the bones of the forelimbs light, hollow, and greatly elongated, the middle finger in some cases exceeding the total length of the body. These lengthened digits support between themselves and their hinder limbs a membrane that opens and closes much like an umbrella. The wing membrane consists of a double layer of skin, one continuous with the hide of the back, the other with that of the abdomen, fused together. The surface of the wing is covered with microscopically minute hairs. To these hairs and the bulbous underlying end organs are attributed the bat's exalted sense of touch. The expanse of these leathery wings is far greater than that of most birds relatively to the size of the body, but the muscles are weaker, and the exterior thumb, with its strong claw, by means of which bats scramble about rocks and buildings, recalls a similar organ in Archaeopteryx. The hind limbs are small, while the knee bends backwards because of the outward twist of the limb. This makes the foot almost useless for walking, but fits it, with its peculiarly strengthened ankle, to be extended straight backward and serve as a means of hanging the body head downwards, the bat's ordinary attitude in rest or sleep. Bats usually produce 2 young at a birth, and the mother carries them about with her. They cling to her breast, where she keeps them warm by folding them within her wings. When they and she are hanging in the branch of a tree, nothing is made in the way of a nest. The fruit-eating bats, division Megachiroptera, are distributed in some 70 species from East Africa to the East Indies, Japan, Australia, and Polynesia. They vary in size from an ounce in weight to some as large as big squirrels, and in form from the grotesque hammerhead of Africa to the many rust-red East Indian species that come naturally by their name of flying foxes, and approach foxes in size. These bats feed on all sweet fruits, and in some regions, as Java, no delicate fruit can be raised unless the tree is protected by nets. It is at night that they make their forays, sleeping during the day in great companies among the branches of some chosen tree. Where a fig tree attracts a crowd of them, we are told by Eastern writers, the roughest fighting begins over coveted plunder, each one screaming, clawing, biting, and struggling to seize something and get away to a secure retreat to enjoy it. No doubt these squabbles are rendered more violent by the dissipated habits in which the bats indulge during their nocturnal expeditions, for, according to Dr. Francis Day and other observers, they often pass the night drinking the toddy from the chatties in the coconut trees, which results either in their returning home in the early morning in a state of extreme and riotous intoxication, or in being found the next day at the foot of the tree, sleeping off the effects of their midnight debauch. The second division, Microchiroptera, contains the carnivorous bats, which include 5 families, 2 of which, the nose-leafed and the desert bats, belong to the warmer parts of the Old World, and the others are tropical, Emballonuridae and Phylostomidae, or have an almost cosmopolitan range, Vespertilionidae. In general the bats of this division are night flyers, and retire during the day to caves, hollow trees, and dark places in old buildings. Such haunts contain great deposits of black guano, which in many places is gathered as a most valuable fertilizer. The rock tombs and temples of Egypt and the East are haunted by thousands of these tenants, and are occupied the year through, but in cool countries the bats migrate or may go into a partial hibernation. The food of most of them, and especially of the Vespertilionidae, to which all those of the United States and Western Europe belong, is exclusively insects, caught on the wing in the twilight hours or in the moonlight, and the service thus done to mankind is of much importance. In the tropics, however, several species, especially of the family Phylostomidae, feed largely on fruit, being provided with long, brush-tipped tongues with which they scrape out the soft interior of the banana and similar fruits. 2 species of this family are the famous vampires of the American tropics. The name recalls a superstition rife in Europe in the Middle Ages as to blood-exhausting fiends which were fabled to lull their victims into unconsciousness by the slow flapping of their wings, and then deprive them of life. The foremost of these vampires is a small reddish species, Desmodus rufus, whose front teeth are like keen daggers, while the cheek teeth have disappeared, having nothing to do, since the animal subsists wholly on a liquid diet. End of section 47, read by Inkell.
Section 48 of Zoology, the Science of Animal Life. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jeremy Lindsay, Zoology, the Science of Animal Life, by Ernest Ingersoll. Man's Humble Cousins. We have now arrived at the highest division of the Mammalia, the order Primates, a term here signifying first, in rank of importance, by reason of the possession of a structure and faculties superior, as a whole, to any other class. It includes the lemurs, the monkeys and baboons, the anthropoid apes, and mankind. Man's undeniable superiority to all the others is intellectual, rather than physical, for in this or that particular he may be inferior in ability to many of the lower animals, and is much less apparent in primitive men than in those highly civilized. All primates have 5 fingers or toes, each covered at the tip by a flat nail, and in most cases the thumb or great toe, or both, are opposable, that is, may be bent around opposite the other digits, so as to form a grasping organ. The higher the primate in the scale of organization, the more perfectly are its forelimbs and hands adapted to seizing and handling objects, and its hind limbs to supporting and moving the body, and the whole sole of the foot rests upon the ground. These and other characteristics fit the primates for life in trees, where nearly all spend their time. The number of young, as a rule, is no more than 2 annually, and they are born in a helpless condition. Hence they must, for a period, be nursed and be carried about by the mother. The food consists almost wholly of fruit and other soft or easily digested vegetable materials, insects, and eggs, and the teeth are of nearly even size. Lemurs, galagos, and aye-ayes. The lemurs, or half-apes, are a large group of small tree-dwelling animals that paleontology shows were in early tertiary times much more closely connected with monkeys than they are now. And it also shows that in a former age, their ancestors were scattered all over the temperate parts of the globe. This assists us to account for the strange distribution of the remnants that now live, a part of them in the Malayan archipelago, and a part in Central Africa and Madagascar, in which island, indeed, lemurs abound more than elsewhere, owing largely, no doubt, to the scarcity of enemies. They differ from monkeys in having elongated jaws, giving a fox-like aspect to the face, in the woolliness of the coat, as a rule, and in their nocturnal habits and weird cries that have been the source of many curious superstitions and a reverence that no monkey ever inspired. The most specialized of the group is a wan little Malayan creature about the size of a small rat, with a long tail, long hind legs, and toes ending in pads that enable the tarsier, or malmag, as it is called, to climb the smoothest bamboo. Its eyes are so big, they seem to leave no room for cheeks. Even more curious is the aye-aye of Madagascar, which resembles a small squirrel with a terrier's face. Its hind feet are like a monkey's hand, and its forefeet are composed of very long, naked fingers, armed with sharp claws, useful in pulling bugs and grubs out of crevices in bark or the pulp out of fruits. The typical lemurs have rounded heads, dog-like muzzles, and a soft, thick, woolly fur of various colors that is usually extended to form a long, bushy tail. And the largest of them, the babakoto of eastern Africa, is as big as a cat and makes the woods ring at night with doleful howls. They hide in holes in trees or in leafy nests during the day, and at night wander about in trees or on the rocks of the mountains they frequent in search of insects and sleeping birds and their eggs, etc. All the lemurs proper and their relatives, the andrinas, belong to Madagascar. On the mainland, a somewhat different race, the galagos, abound throughout Central Africa and are renowned for their leaping powers, general activity, and willingness to eat anything they can catch or find ripe in the way of sweet fruit. They are interesting as pets. The slow lemurs of the Malayan Islands, on the other hand, are noted for their sleepiness, moving about the trees with such sloth-like sluggishness and caution that it is a wonder they ever capture enough food to keep alive. They are regarded with great fear by the natives, not because they are more harmful than the other lemurs, which are also dreaded, but because of strange supernatural powers attributed to them. These ideas are older than our science, for the name lemurs given them means ghosts. A remarkable thing about the primates is that they show, even in man himself, many structural traits recalling the anatomy of that remote source of so many mammalian branches, the creodonts. And the lemurs seem to stand between the Insectivora and the primates, and are certainly the most ancient part of the latter order, with many affinities to the former. In a similar way, they are connected with the monkeys and apes by the marmosets. A very suggestive fact is that the scattered distribution of modern lemurs much resembles that of the comparatively few existing Insectivoras, especially as to Madagascar, which was united with the continent of Africa during the earlier half of the Tertiary era. Marmosets, monkeys, and baboons. The marmosets, or titis, are a small family, Hapelidae, of little arboreal, monkey-like creatures, much enjoyed as pets in the American tropics, but rarely able to endure our northern winters even when protected most carefully from the cold. They look and act much like pretty squirrels, have long but not prehensile tails, and some of them, as the tamarines, have long, silky manes. They possess several lemur-like features and, as has been said, are a connecting link between the lemurs and the monkeys proper. All the monkeys of the world are members of one or the other of two families only, the Cebidae, all-American, and the Cercopithecidae, confined to the Old World. They differ in several structural particulars, among others in the number of teeth and in the matter of bare spots of naked skin on the buttocks not seen in the Cebidae, in the prehensility of the tail, exclusively American, etc. But the most striking difference between the two groups is found in the nostrils. In the Old World monkeys and apes, catarrhines, the nostrils look downward and are close together. In American monkeys, platarians, they are widely separated and look outward. This absolute distinction between the primates of the two hemispheres has existed as far back as the race can be traced by paleontologists, who have discovered no intermediate forms. The American monkeys, or sons of Cebidae, as Dr. Cope once expressed it, comprise the capuchins, Cebus, which may be taken as the representative genus, the woolly monkeys, Lagothrix, the spider monkeys, Atelids and Eriodes, the howlers, Mycetes, the sakis, Pithecia and Brachyurus, the night monkeys, or Dirucules, Nycticeius, and the squirrel monkeys, or Cimeres, Chrysothrix and Calothrix. All are small, the largest having a body no more than 20 inches in length, and are hairy or woolly, without any naked callosities. Their headquarters are in the great forests of equatorial South America, which is the exclusive home of many species, some of which are restricted to narrow areas, the gray rivers, often acting as impassable boundaries. No monkeys ascend high in the Andes or reach the west coast, and none is found far south of the forests of Brazil or north of south-central Mexico. They are adapted to a life in trees, and most of them are aided in security in hurrying about their precarious paths through the treetops by the fact that the tip of the tail, naked on the underside, will almost automatically curl around a branch, gripping it so firmly that the animal may hang by this grasp alone, leaving all four hands and feet free for other service. Their agility, especially in the smaller, long-legged spider monkeys, is proverbial, but one must not believe the old wonder tales of living bridges and the like. Best known are the capuchins, which furnish most of the pets and organ grinder slaves seen in the United States, and their manner of life is substantially that of the whole tribe, with such exceptions as that of the big-eyed Diruculus, which are strictly nocturnal in habit, and the big, reddish howlers that make the forest ring with lion-like roars at certain times, giving the impression that a large company are howling in chorus, when it is only a solitary old male that makes all the noise. The capuchins, like most other species, go about in small, orderly bands, led by the oldest male, and remain most of the time in very tall trees. Bates, in his Naturalist on the Amazons, describes how, when the foremost of a flock of monkeys reaches the outermost branch of a tall tree, he springs forth into the air without a moment's hesitation, and alights on the dome of yielding foliage belonging to the neighboring tree, maybe 50 feet beneath, all the rest following his example. The Old World monkeys are, as a family, of higher grade, larger size, and greater historical interest than those of America. Fossil remains show that the tribe is an old one, and was once able to range all over Europe. Now the few half-captive and altogether mischievous apes on the rock of Gibraltar represent all that remain of a species once numerous even in northern France, and so recently as the Pleistocene. This ape is a Macacus, a genus that otherwise is purely Asiatic and contains some of the most celebrated of the monkeys. Thus, the suitably named pig-tailed Macacus of the Far East is trained in Sumatra and Borneo to climb the coconut palms and select and throw down ripe nuts, the most really useful thing to the credit of monkeys. The Japanese species is the one that is so much used in the decorative designs of that artistic people, and the best known of all is the common Bengal or rhesus monkey, which is revered by some sects of Hindus and is treated with tolerance or made a pet of or an aid to jugglers throughout India. Several other macaques are common pets and servants in the East. The macaques go about in flocks and often come to the ground. All have the habit of cramming food into their cheek pouches for mastication at leisure. The majority of the species are very docile when young. Closely related to the macaques are the mangabis, or white eye-lidded monkeys of West Africa, and the Central African genus Cercopithecus, which includes many small-sized, handsome, tree-living kinds, of which the most widely known is the Diana monkey, whose long fringe of white hair hanging from its neck and chest is in much demand in the fur market. Even nearer relatives are those interesting, but often repulsive creatures, the baboons, between which and macaques stands the dog-like, stub-tailed, ground-keeping black ape of Celebes. This eastern instance of an otherwise African group, like the single western macaque, indicates what fossil remains prove that both genera were once far more wide-ranging than at present. The African baboons, of which there are about a dozen species, present striking peculiarities in appearance, and all are much alike. In size they vary from the bigness of a spaniel to that of a mastiff, and a comparison with dogs is apt, for these apes go about habitually on all fours. Their limbs are stout and of about equal length, and their heads and muzzles are canine, hence the ancient name cynocephala, dog-headed. In some, as the mandrill, the naked nose is swollen at the sides like a hog's snout, thrown into ridges and colored black, pale pink, or blue and purple, while the great callosities on the stern are of the same or contrasted colors. The fur is blackish, or yellowish or greenish, grizzled by the fact that every hair is ringed with various colors, or the coat may be party-colored. They go in bands, sometimes exceeding 100 individuals of all ages, and choose for their lairs cliffs and rocky ridges, full of crevices and thickets, such as the extraordinary black rocks of Angola, where the yellow baboon dwells in thousands, and subsists mainly on lichens. In such places they are safe against any enemies except leopards, which the old males are said to be able to vanquish, and the larger serpents or birds of prey. And these can make away only with the young now and then. Dogs dare not attack full-size baboons, which have been seen again and again going fearlessly to the aid of some little one that dogs have tried to seize. Their sense of smell is amazingly keen, especially for hidden water springs in the desert. It is recorded that the Bushmen of the Kalahari Plains used to train captives to help them search for water when famine was impending, and undoubtedly the observation of what roots, etc., these animals were accustomed to eat taught the earliest human venturers into these regions what might be used there in the way of food. Baboons also eat lizards and the like, and are fond of honey and certain gums. With these habits, it is not surprising that they are everywhere exceedingly harmful to plantations, tearing up or trampling down more than they can consume, and destroying a field in a night. Some of these baboons are as tameable and teachable as other monkeys, but they grow unruly and ferocious as they become old. They were tamed and trained in ancient Egypt, where a religious sect held the shaggy Arabian species Cynocephalus hamadryas to be sacred to Thoth, whose statues are a human figure with a baboon's head. Gibbon, chimpanzee, gorilla, orangutan. This brings us to the anthropoid, man-like, apes of the family, Simidae, which differ from the inferior apes that have been described in fewer particulars than their size and appearance might suggest. Thoroughly arboreal, for the most part, when these apes come to the ground, they progress in a semi-erect fashion. Moreover, when they put their hands upon the ground to aid in walking, they do not rest their weight, as do the lower apes, upon the flat of the hand, but upon the back of the fingers. None of the anthropoids has a tail. The gibbons are an Indo-Malayan group of monkey-like anthropoids with small, long-nosed faces and arms so long that when the gibbon stands erect, the fingers touch the ground. By means of these long arms, they swing themselves through the treetops with astonishing speed and are adept at climbing and leaping about the mountain slopes that are their favorite resorts. All gibbons are noted for their far-carrying voices, and often a band will utter weird howls in chorus, answered by another band, so that the forest is filled with indescribable noises. The largest is the jet-black Sumatran siamang, 3 feet tall. In the same region, precisely eastern Sumatra and Borneo, lives a larger relative, the orangutan, man of the woods, or Mias, as it is known to the Dayak. Like the gibbons, it feeds on leaves, buds, and soft fruits, especially the big, pulpy durian, and also, like them, is shy and mild in disposition. This Malayan ape is smaller and weaker than its African cousins, male standing not more than 4 feet 6 inches and weighing 160 pounds, while the females are smaller. The body is bulky, the belly protuberant, and the legs very short, while the arms are so long that the fingers hang down to the ankle. The coat is a variable dark brick red and long, forming a beard in old males. The head is short and high, with the bony crest of the skull and the ridge over the eyes less prominent than in the gorilla, while the nose is insignificant and the jaws are large and protrusive, with a long, smooth upper lip. The eyes have a pleading expression. The ears are small and closely oppressed, and many of the older males have the cheeks greatly and distinctively broadened by flat callosities. Lastly, although its brain is most like that of a man, the orangutan is inferior, in general, to both the gorilla and the chimpanzee. The chimpanzee and gorilla belong together, not only because both are African, but because they are more closely related to one another than the Malayan anthropoids. The chimpanzee is to be found in the equatorial forests north of the Congo, and also are along the upper valley of the Nile and about the Great Lakes. But the gorilla seems to be restricted to the rough coastal region between the Congo and Cameroon. Both are black-haired apes, growing nearly to the height of a man of medium size, but with short legs, very long arms, massive chests and shoulders, and huge strength. The face and palms of the chimpanzee are pale flesh color, those of the gorilla black. Both make their homes in trees, feeding on succulent leaves, sprouts, and fruit, and like the orangutans, making nightly platform-like nests of branches on which to sleep. But the old male gorilla is said to sleep on the ground at the base of the tree in which its family reposes. Both spend much time on the ground hunting for food, and they invade the plantations of the Negroes, who are greatly afraid of them and wreak much damage there. Dr. Garner, whose investigations of their habits, in his attempt to learn whether they and the monkeys of the region had anything that might be called rudiments of a language, resulted in adding much of importance in regard to them, reported that despite its superior strength, the gorilla was in constant fear of the more active chimpanzee, and fled whenever one approached. The best and most recent observations indicate that the gorilla is not quarrelsome and aggressive, but disposed to hide away from and avoid men whenever it can, rather than to attack them. Nevertheless, all these great apes are debased, savage brutes, of which nothing good may be said, despite the fact that when caught, young chimpanzees, at least, prove docile and able to learn some simple imitations of human behavior. But in old age, Even they become sullen and dangerous toward trainers who have treated them with uniform kindness. They are base caricatures of men, sidelines of development that have proved failures in nature's experiments toward making something out of simian material. The successful line of human descent began far back of their earliest Pacific history and has developed quite independent of these brutal offshoots from some parental stem of which we have no definite knowledge. End of section 48. End of Zoology, The Science of Animal Life by Ernest Ingersoll.